Okay, so let me just do the 1-2 minute reprise. Are we ready?
We are ready. We are broadcasting, and let me just bring up YouTube to double check that. Bring up the channel. Just in case anybody, yep, we are on. So in case anybody gets bumped off the Zoom, they can always watch there. I am going to take myself off, and you can start.
Okay, just to begin our second day of our summit number 9, Ukraine's annual report card. Because of our rich schedule on the second day, I will dispense opening the second day with the usual review of the major messages of the first day. Just an ultra quick 2-minute reprise. The keynotes addressing yesterday's special highlight sessions, Speaker Rozumkova and Ambassador Markova in the morning and Representative Kaptur in the afternoon, were tasked to remind us why Ukraine, being free, whole, prosperous, and at peace, still mattered. It appears that 4 key reasons were provided. In a hyper-distilled form, they were: 1, Ukraine truly is a security firewall for the Euro-Atlantic community on the entity's Eastern Front. It provides a irreplaceable buffer. My ad would be, if Kiev went, could Vilnius or even Warsaw and Bucharest remain defensible? 2, Ukraine, for all its occasional political quirkiness, has remained a beacon of democracy in the post-Soviet space. If Vlad could collapse it, he would certainly score points for the authoritarian model in the said space. 3, Ukraine was once a critical crossroads of trade, note the old Silk Road route. It, with its own particular relations with the Caucasus and Central Asia, could once again play that role, both in trade and energy transit, providing alternatives to the existing RU and PRC dominated economic linkage routes between the Euro-Atlantic world and the world of South and East Asia. Finally, a peaceful Ukraine would likely guarantee demographic stability in Europe. A chaotic Ukraine with other Guam countries possibly following suit would likely create the opposite effect. Okay, as for the panels that comprised the report card, 2 were run yesterday. The first was intended to measure the amount of progress and regress Ukraine has had in the past year in creating a democratic polity. The second was intended to measure the amount of progress, regress Ukraine had in the past year in economic matters and energy security. The tally master will have the numbers for each of the graders and the grades the audience provided upon hearing the experts. But I will let the cat out of the bag a bit. The general grade for democracy building in UA this year was approximately B- to C+, leaning towards C+, approximately where it was last year, 2019-20. The numbers for the panel that merged economic issues and energy issues showed divergent trends in the named categories. In pre-COVID times, the items would have been measured separately. On the matter of energy security and transport, some brutal numbers in the D category. But in the sound fiscal and monetary category, a number of A's. So again, generally B+, B-, C+, leaning towards C+, actually a very and surprising a bit better than last year, despite a spat of very tough criticism. Finally, in regard to the special discussion about the US, Ukraine, and we added NATO vis-a-vis the Black Sea with 2 resident Black Sea region experts, General Hodges and Doc Blank, both agreed that the Black Sea was vitally important for the 3 named entities. None could afford to see the sea become a Russian ozero or a lake. Both agreed that regrettably there appears to be no coordinated plan of action or defense. General Hodges added that the problem was more political than military. The military could only start addressing the issue that the political will was exhibited. Okay, having said all that, let's get right back into things with our morning keynote, our 3rd panel on general security, our 4th panel merging the issues of social cohesion and national identity, and our 2 afternoon keys and final tally of grades. To begin, I wish to invite morning highlight focus chair Ukrainian World Congress Executive Director Mariana Kupriyanova, and a returning favorite of the summit series, the chair of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on Matters for Integration of Ukraine with the European Union, Pani Ivana Klempush-Tenzadze. Their topic, how the West and the US and the West generally can help Ukraine realize its Euro-Atlantic vision. Ms. Maria, I'm sorry that I took as much as I did. Time, I said 2 minutes, but the session is all yours now. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Walter, for once again spearheading this important summit. It is my honor to welcome you to day 2 of our US-UA Working Group Yearly Summit. Following on a day of intense discussions with high-profile speakers, our opening session today, as Walter just mentioned, will focus on how US can best help Ukraine attain its Euro-Atlantic vision, UA perspective. This annual summit is taking place amid an unprecedented time for Ukraine and its key allies, on the heels of G7, NATO, US-EU summits, and literally 24 hours after the meeting of President Biden and Putin in Geneva. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine and recent massive buildup of Russian troops at Ukraine's borders, Russia's imminent threat to peace and security in the whole region were once again brought into the focus of the international community. At the same time, Ukraine's progress of democratic reforms, its Euro-Atlantic integration journey, and the path to NATO membership were also brought into the global spotlight. However, following these summits, many questions remain unanswered for Ukraine and for its key partners and allies. The Ukrainian World Congress and our member organizations worldwide is committed to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations and building a prosperous, secure, and democratic future for Ukraine. As the global Ukrainian diaspora, we engage with top-level government decision makers, members of parliaments, and civil society thought leaders to build an international coalition of support for Ukraine. The Ukrainian World Congress and its member organizations in over 65 countries globally spearheads powerful global advocacy campaigns to deoccupy Crimea and Donbass, accelerate NATO membership action plan for Ukraine, stop Nord Stream 2, and support democratic reforms in Ukraine. The Ukrainian World Congress Committee of America, that is actually one of the founding members of the Ukrainian World Congress, as well as its Washington, D.C.-based bureau, the Ukrainian National Information Service, and many grassroots Ukrainian organizations that the UCCA brings together, they lead an extraordinary coordinated effort to strengthen US-Ukraine relations. As the Ukrainian World Congress, we firmly believe that NATO membership is the surest and fastest path to restoring peace in Ukraine and ensuring security for the entire region. We also believe that Ukraine's reform progress is crucial for its Euro-Atlantic vision, that is the democratic choice enshrined in the Constitution of Ukraine. So what is the fair assessment of the progress of reforms in Ukraine today? What are the main takeaways from the most recent summits for Ukraine and its key allies? What further support is required from the US as well as the collective West for Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic vision? And most importantly, what role can the Ukrainian global diaspora, united by the Ukrainian World Congress, play in strengthening this support and making progress where it counts? Today, I have the honor to welcome a special speaker, Ivana Klempush-Tenzadze, chair of the Committee on European Integration in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. She's a leading member of Ukraine's European Solidarity Party, and as former Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine, Ivana has a unique perspective on the topic of our today's discussion. Dear Ivana, the floor is yours. Вітаю, пані Івано, та прошу до слова.
Dear Maria, dear Walter, dear friends, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for making a very perfect planning for your event exactly in the days in the hours, not even 24 hours after all the major meetings of major importance have happened between the US leader and many other leaders, including G7 group leaders, including NATO allies, and including Mr. Putin as well. Let me just say that from my perspective, after all these meetings, and that's also both good and bad news at the same time, we do not see any real change of the geopolitical context for Ukraine. Right, I'm very happy to see that NATO has adopted the decision where it referred back to its earlier decision of Bucharest 2008 summit on prospect of the Ukrainian membership in NATO, meaning that MAP will be the next step on this journey. And I may be sounding a little bit ambitious. That's stating the obvious. Ukraine will become the NATO member, and we right now have to focus all together on how to get to that point. And obviously, that requires two major components. One being an international component, and overcoming the skepticism and some of the political hesitation that we see in some of the capitals in the among NATO allies. And also, and I think for us Ukrainians on both sides of the Atlantic, so to say, a very important task is Ukraine delivering for its own people, for its own society, for the state and the existence of the state on actual transformative actions, on real reform agenda, because unfortunately what we are seeing in the latest period of time, there are so many declarations coming out from Ukraine which are not unfortunately backed with systemic efforts, and that's definitely not something that helps us in our common goal to follow through with the Euro-Atlantic agenda, with the European integration agenda, and actually our trustful communication with the common West. I think that you all probably, since you are watching closely the developments in Ukraine, you probably have noticed that several months ago, back in March, there were a whole bunch of Ukrainian politicians, experts, analysts, civil society leaders, and American counterparts who have signed like 12 major points where we see that our cooperation, our strategic partnership between Ukraine and the US, and for that matter, with the collective West, could be what kind of points that they should be and could be built around. And that covered basically all those things that some of which have been mentioned also already by Walter. I'll just name a couple of them because it started from the main and a very important thing from my point of view after the Revolution of Dignity, that democratic values must remain at the core of US-Ukraine relationship, basically at the core of the Ukraine collective West relationship. It was about support of restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and deterrence of the further Russian aggression. It was about raising and trying to look for new approaches, how to raise stakes for Russian Federation, and how to ensure that the cost and benefit calculation for Kremlin for intrusion into Ukraine, for aggression against Ukraine is kind of elevated. It was also about engagement of the US in the consultations, in the process that is the so-called peace process that is unfortunately a bit frozen at this particular moment, of trying to solve the international conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where right now the leadership is behind Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, for example. Also, it's about restoration of Crimea in Ukraine, within part of Ukraine, and maybe right now this Crimean platform that is being initiated and that is initiated by the current Ukrainian authorities, by President Zelensky and the team. Maybe that's one of the approaches where additional positive push could be given to putting Ukraine back high on the collective West or US and Ukraine's agenda. Also, we then at that particular moment, we were also tackling security and stability in the Black Sea region, including NATO support and the support of the European partners. We were tackling common combating hybrid threats, in cyberspace, in information space, and so on. Obviously, Nord Stream 2, that's something that is right there for us. And I think it's, it's a matter that requires a very frank and very, open discussion between us as partners, between Ukraine and the US. And I think here a lot is still possible to be done. Well, a couple of those points were focused on supporting Ukraine reform agenda. It was about judicial system reform, corporate management reform, independence of different bodies in Ukraine. And I thought at that point that maybe, all those security points are much more important than these last ones that were tackling commitment of the Ukrainian government and urgency of its commitment to actually deliver on democratic reforms in Ukraine. But now I can say that I think it would be my call to our audience and our friends back in the US to actually try to see the instruments and mechanisms, how to encourage to get our Ukrainian authorities out of the virtual reality, and how to ensure that we are back on track on those sometimes not popular, sometimes not communication appealing reforms that have been delivered over the last years after the revolution of dignity, but that have brought us a serious results. For example, I think the whole world applauded a very tough move of the Ukrainian authorities previously when we were cleaning up our banking system, when we actually ensured for the independence of the National Bank of Ukraine. And now we see just these days here in the Ukrainian parliament, we see yet another attack on the independence of the National Bank of Ukraine. And supposedly that could happen, that could go through. Unfortunately, in the early 2019, the judicial reform that has been started back in 2016-17 has been halted. And since then, no movement on judicial reform, which is the core for Ukrainian success, has not been delivered upon. So I have plethora of such examples where my heart is breaking when I see the reverse from where we've been and the loss of time that what we are seeing today. So therefore, my call here would be that probably the US, can try to get back, and I'm sorry to say this, but to the principle, not only more for more, which is important principle, but I think it's about support and wider level of assistance in return for real reforms, not declarations. This is important for Ukrainian people. We will benefit from the real honest approach to what is happening in Ukraine at this particular moment. And I think because I'm very worried when I'm hearing from the head of our state, from the current president. Just yesterday, we heard that we do not need real cooperation with the IMF. It sounds like that particular serial that the country has watched a couple of years ago, and somehow there is an informational campaign right now speaking out on unacceptability of so-called Western influence in Ukraine, which I totally take as a nonsense. And we do believe, and we are here as part of the Ukrainian community that believes that we only with engagement of our Western partners, only with the experience of our Western partners, only with the support of the civil society here in Ukraine, and only with the people in the government and in the parliament, in the office of the president, willing to move on the reform agenda, we can succeed. I'm sure that without any of these three, Western involvement and push sometimes, unfortunately, as you were very, very frank with us. You've always pointed with the government I used to work with. It was not always an easy dialogue, but it was a very important dialogue for the success of the country. So the Western involvement, Ukrainian civil society, which I really, really ask you to pay a special attention to. It's very important that we cherish further the Ukrainian civil society, and that we are counting on their actual role in future building of Ukraine. And and that's kind of sandwich will help us people within the parliament, within the government, even current government, and hopefully with in the office of the president, to get back to real reform agenda in Ukraine.
Thank you, Pani Ivano, for your eloquent presentation and sharing your vision with us. I note that we only have 7 minutes left on this panel, and we've got quite a number of questions coming in. So I'd like to elaborate on your vision of the NATO summit outcomes for Ukraine. As you mentioned, summit communique reiterated the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance with a membership action plan as an integral part of the process. Just hot off the press, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary, just today mentioned that NATO membership will be a red line for Russia. At the same time, President Biden said yesterday that the continuing Donbass conflict is not a showstopper for accession. But reform progress, especially in tackling corruption, has been identified as the main blockage. So in that context, I'd like to ask you, is that really a fair assessment of reforms in Ukraine? Might this become a receding horizon, never reached, that makes Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations unreachable? And what can the role of diaspora organizations be in making progress where it counts?
I'm saddened to say that, unfortunately, as I've mentioned in my initial presentation, that some of the huge parts of the reform agenda has been reversed in Ukraine, and that's obviously is seen also from outside. And therefore, it's very important that we here ensure that our authorities are reading this hints also from NATO summit communique, also from press briefings, also from direct contacts with our partners in the West, not only in the US, that there is a goodwill on behalf of the West to actually help. But for that goodwill to further materialize, is important also to deliver upon from us. So I wish the situation was better. I wish that that I could trumpet for the huge successes of Ukraine at this particular moment, but I think we have lost quite some time in our efforts, and right now I think it's important to speed up. And there is a capacity to speed up, with this unique situation with, mono-majority and several democratic forces who are supportive of Euro-Atlantic integration. of Ukraine, we can together, but just together, push this, this vehicle, Ukraine's vehicle, to the great goals. But at the same time, again, it requires honesty. And with regard to what diaspora, great asset of Ukraine that is, I believe, under engaged, with all those great things that you are doing, I think Ukraine as a state is not reaching out as much as it should to the diaspora and offering instruments of influence on the situation in Ukraine. And I think here we can maybe try together to think of the, COVID has taught us that the world can digitalize almost totally. So maybe let's see how we can use this experience of online communication as a possibility of engagement of different audiences of Ukrainian diaspora in not only in the US or Canada, but in other countries, in terms of drafting proposals, in terms of engaging, maybe, on not only through big organizations, but engaging in the work and expertise of even governmental institutions. I think some of those kind of creative ways of engagement could be used right now. But we also very much count on Ukrainian diaspora across the world that Ukraine will not be, with all these different challenges that are coming up every day, starting from COVID or from new raising powers and economic expansionist plans of some of the countries and so on, or digital or information or cyber attacks and so on, that Ukraine is not sliding down on the agenda and from the radars of attention of our Western partners. There is a temptation to say, okay, well, if you are not moving forward, then just forget about you. I don't think it's the right approach. We've seen such approach once already years ago towards Ukraine, and it didn't work out well. So there are quite a few things where we can work together and knocking on the doors of your parliaments, knocking on the doors of your of the countries where you are living, of your governments, and making sure that basically values are not traded for even important interests of your countries. So we believe that Ukraine and its struggle against Russian Federation here is of highest value and importance, geopolitical importance, not only for the region, but actually for the whole world.
Thank you, Pani Ivano. And following on that, we have a question from the audience. What can the US do immediately to help Ukraine regarding the security situation?
The security situation? Well, I hope, first, I am glad that President Biden yesterday has clearly underlined that the US, and I think there he also represented Collective West, is fully supportive further of the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine. And I hope that this means that we have, instruments at hand how this further could be demonstrated. Here, there are plenty of things. As far as I understand, our Ukrainian authorities are trying to seek support of the US and response of the US in signing the security defense agreement between the two countries. I think that could be a great framework for our cooperation in the security sphere, and that could be actually a clear signal that it's much more than just than these efforts that have been taking place up to date, even though we are highly appreciative of all that financial support, of the defense and military support that we have been receiving from the US. I think that should be definitely continued. However, I do encourage you to use conditionality. This is still important because we have to succeed. We have to become stronger and have to succeed. So further continuing with this assistance, also I think Black Sea and Azov Sea region, that's and the basic absence of the naval capacity of Ukraine, creates a very serious threat and very serious challenge where we believe your engagement is very much necessary. Nord Stream 2, that's where the US can actually help Ukraine immediately, because that's an existential threat for Ukraine. It's not only about us losing money. It's not only about us, ruining our capacity as a transit country. It's definitely an invitation for the Russian Federation to further attack Ukraine. And that's not something that we see our partners and strategic partners based on values can do to us. So I think, your Atlantic cohesion between the US and Berlin is Washington and Berlin is extremely important, but I think we should not get lost in this cooperation. So that's already 4, and okay, let's stop on this. Let's start from this 4.
Thank you so much for this very open and very insightful discussion today. It provided lots of great insights to start off our day. Thank you, Pani Ivanno. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to Walter to start the next session.
Still muted, Walter. Still muted.
I like to mute myself. Maria, wonderful work. Thank you very much. Pani Ivanka, as always, you're a marvelous spokesperson for Ukraine in any form in the world. And I thank you for your very informative session. And I thank you for keeping it within the time framework. That's delightful. Thank you again to both of you. Thank you. Now to our third panel, and a cast. Essentially, we've already started with a cast right out of C-SPAN. Now we're dealing with a cast out of C-SPAN Goes Network. Choose your own favorite: C-SPAN, CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Another distinguished senior U.S. diplomat, the chair, Ambassador William Courtney, and 4 top headliners: Ambassador Kurt Volker, now it's SIPA; Jamestown Foundation's President Glenn Howard; James Shearer of both Chatham House and Estonia International Center of Defense and Security fame; and Alice Gray, now at the American Foreign Policy Council, but just recently having been the National Security Council's Chief of Staff. The topic: grading Ukraine on security. Ambassador Courtney, Bill, the session is yours.
Walter, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We do really have terrific panelists today. Let me just begin by quoting some of the key statements on Ukraine at the NATO EU summits this week, and Biden's comments as well. The NATO summit communique on Monday, quote, "We call on Russia to withdraw its forces stationed in all 3 countries," meaning Ukraine, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. "We strongly condemn and will not recognize Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea. Russia's recent massive military buildup and destabilizing activities in and around Ukraine have further escalated tensions. We call on Russia to reverse its military buildup and stop restricting navigation in parts of the Black Sea. We also call on Russia to stop impeding access to the Sea of Azov and Ukrainian ports. We reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit, as was just mentioned, that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance with a membership action plan. And this is important. We will continue to focus our dialogue with Russia on critical issues. The conflict in and around Ukraine is, in current circumstances, the first topic on our agenda, the first topic on NATO's agenda. The US-EU summit on Tuesday, a more brief statement, but we condemn Russia's continued actions to undermine Ukraine's and Georgia's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, and we support the reform path of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And finally, Biden's comments this week. On Monday in Brussels, Biden was asked about Ukraine's possible admission to NATO. He said, quote, "It remains to be seen. In the meantime, we will do all we can to put Ukraine in a position to be able to continue to resist Russian physical aggression," end quote. He said that NATO admission, quote, "depends on whether they meet the criteria. The fact is they still have to clean up corruption and meet other criteria to get into the action plan," end quote. And then in his press conference yesterday, Biden said he told Putin that the US would maintain an, quote, "unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We agreed to pursue diplomacy related to the Minsk agreement," end quote. So as you can see from this, while there was some speculation in Ukraine that there might be some kind of a deal done with Putin on Ukraine that would be at Ukraine's disadvantage, that clearly did not happen. And there is broad support, deep support really in the West for Ukraine. We have 4 great speakers today. I've asked them to hold their opening remarks to 8 to 9 minutes so that we can get to Q&A. First is Ambassador Kurt Volker. Kurt, thanks for joining us from Istanbul.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for the picture quality and everything here, but I am joining you from the airport lounge in Istanbul, and I hope you can hear me okay. Doing it also from my iPhone because the internet is a little shaky on the computer. But thank you for the opportunity, Walter, to be here, and thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and it's good to see the other panelists. And I just want to say how nice it was to see Ivana as well and hear some of her remarks. Such clear thinking and such a strong message, and very good to catch up on that. Concerning the topic at hand, I have 4 or 5 points I just want to raise. I'm not going to go on maybe even for a full 9 minutes, but the first one is I think everyone in the US needs to understand that the Ukrainian military's performance, their ability to fight as a fighting force, is significantly improved over 2015 and 2014. This is a lot of battle-tested people. They've had training, they've had equipment, they've had innovation within the ranks and within their procedures and within their capacities because of the fighting that's been going on. So this is not the Ukrainian military of 5 or 6 years ago. This is a substantial force. This means that it would be very, very difficult for Russia to launch new incursions into Ukraine beyond the territory it already occupies and deny it. And this removal of deniability is a very important factor that comes along with a more capable Ukrainian military. So I think that's one thing I think people should understand. And this has come with some help from allies, from the United States, from the UK, from Canada, from Lithuania, from Poland. But a lot has been learned by the Ukrainians on the battlefield, and it's significant. The second thing I would say is that there are still substantial gaps in the Ukrainian military capacities as compared to what a well-rounded national military force should be able to do. And this is where the defense advisors to the Ministry of Defense, there's a core group of them. The U.S. is participating in that. This is where they should be focusing, and they are. This should be the focus of U.S. FMF and also FMS. So foreign military financing from U.S. assistance, but also sales. And we should be open to serious purchases and procurement by Ukraine as well. We try to get our allies to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Ukraine spends 7%. And so there is a capacity to procure, and we should be very supportive of that, lenient on that, to help them build the capacities they need. What are these gaps? They are in air defense. They are in maritime domain awareness and coastal defense capability. They are in Coast Guard cutters. They are in blue water naval capacity, counter electronics warfare, counter drone warfare, secure drone activity. And all of these are things that US companies and US FMF budget could support. And so I think these are topics for bilateral discussion and also discussion in the advisors group for Ukraine so we can figure out how to do this. So first we have capability, much improved. Second, we have gaps. Then we have a few areas of still needed improvement. And where the military performance has been dramatically improved, I think the civilian control of the military and the modernization of the Ministry of Defense, the civilian side, has more work to do. And I think they need more assistance with that from NATO countries. So I think defense ministry reform and modernization can still go further. And defense industry reform has significantly lagged. Ukraine has some jewels in its defense industry capabilities, but they are encased in a lot of other stuff, which is not a jewel. And I think that is something that to do for a long time. But Mauritius was interested in doing that. Much US and others could be with. I think that Ukraine has the capacity to build a strong national defense industry. And I underscore national. We're not talking about selling to outsiders, not talking about China buying things. This should be a national Ukrainian defense capability, taking the best of what they have and making more out of it. And the first priority of such a national defense industry is supplying Ukraine's own troops on the front. That they need to be looking at what they can do to make sure they have a robust capacity to provide everything, all the kit that the troops on the front need. And then looking additionally at some of the higher tech and the more highly engineered things of which Ukraine is capable that would be suitable for export as well. And this, I think, also could be a topic of US-Ukrainian and NATO-Ukrainian discussion in the defense industry context. How could we help Ukraine develop its defense industry to be globally competitive? And then the final point, I'll bring up NATO. And Bill, I appreciate your reading the text of the communique and the language there. I have one semi-critical comment on this, however. We are repeating the same language from Bucharest that we have used since 2008. We say that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, but that map is indispensable. And then we won't give Ukraine the map. So it becomes a bit of a catch-22. I understand all of the arguments, and I agree with arguments that there is more Ukraine needs to do to be ready to become a member of NATO. I have no disagreement with that at all. But the signaling from the United States and the signaling from NATO is not, you are going to make it, we are going to help you, here's the pathway. It is, nope, not now. And that's it. Nope, not now. And so I hope that as we move on, we're past the Putin summit now. I think we're going to see that Putin is not going to change his behavior after this summit. I hope that the United States decides under President Biden to take a greater leadership role in outlining the pathway by which NATO and Georgia will become members of NATO and leading all that in the alliance, working that with the countries concerned, working that with our allies so that we actually start to have momentum again and not the stagnation we've had for 13 years. So I'll pause there and I'll put myself back on mute. Thank you for having me.
Kurt, that's really terrific. And thanks for being so cogent and covering so much material so well. Yes, your point about Ukraine's ability to fight significantly better than 2014 and 15 is useful to put in context in that in 2014, when the Ukrainian forces pushed back the Russian forces, the Ukrainians didn't really have any Western support. So the Ukrainians did a lot of good fighting on their own, and now they're even better. Our second panelist, Glenn Howard. Glenn?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for Walter and for inviting me to speak today, and I appreciate the opportunity, and I very much enjoy seeing all my colleagues and friends, at least virtually. Some I haven't seen in face-to-face in quite some time. I think My perspective is going to be pretty much slightly different than in terms of how I see the direction of Ukraine, where it's going, and what I've been focusing on. And Walter, thank you so much for allowing me to speak about what we see with defense and security. I mean, every 6 months, this is a great opportunity to kind of reflect on Ukraine and where Ukraine is going. And my opinion has not changed much. And I think it's good to talk about the good and the bad and the ugly about Ukraine. I think it's important to emphasize the point that Ukraine has made advances in its defense and security needs. I mean, first and foremost is Ukraine is not Georgia. Ukraine is a population of over 40 million. It has vast manpower reserves and defense industrial capabilities that, if properly oriented, can make it potentially into what I would call West Germany defending the Fulda Gap. And but the problem here is that I think that we are too focused on technology solutions and not making Ukraine, forcing Ukraine to adapt and make the types of military reforms that it needs to make, and that we're kind of leaving Ukraine on its own. We give them technology, we sell them javelins, we want to focus on systems, but the problem is the ability of Ukraine to try to adapt and develop those systems and integrate those into its armed forces. And the old adage is that you can sell Ukraine javelins, but if the command and control of Ukraine and its senior military leadership does not know how to integrate those weapons into its defense, then you're going to have problems. A case in point, counter battery radar that we gave Ukraine that was used in Debaltseve. 2 of those counter battery radars were destroyed. The Ukrainian friends of mine assured me that those batteries would be used. They were effective, and Ukraine knew how to operate them, and they were able to adapt and use them to do things that they weren't designed for. Kudos to Ukraine for that. But the problem was the senior military leadership of Ukraine put those in the front lines, and luckily they were destroyed, but they weren't captured by the Russians. So the danger here is giving Ukraine technology and then expecting them to be able to integrate it when their senior military leadership that does not speak English, but relies on its Soviet past to guide it in terms of how it wants to use these systems. So the topic, what I wanted to focus on specifically, is the deterrence effects of US assistance to Ukraine. This is where I think the United States needs to focus more on. And our problem is we shake their hands. We say, okay, we're going to give you more of X, Y, and Z. We're going to give you 150 million in assistance. Okay, great, good job. And then we kind of go home, and then we kind of leave it up to the general staff and Ukrainian military to make and use the assistance that we give them in a way that's useful. Now, my problem is on the this is where I was speaking about the deterrence effects. We are now approaching almost a decade. Okay, we are in the 7th year since 2014, and we are now approaching in 2021. In 2024, we will be at a decade since the invasion of Crimea. Where is Ukrainian military? Is it better than it was in the past? Will it reach any type of milestones in the 10 years? And my guess is no. Ukraine doesn't have the capabilities to defend itself with maritime capabilities. Odessa is still wide open. They still depend on US Aegis class destroyers to periodically show up in the Black Sea and try to deter the Russians. And what does a difference in a decade mean? Well, I can tell you what a decade means. Azerbaijan used a decade of military reform and military rearmament using a variety of sources, none of which was US made. But they used their oil resources in a very highly effective way to retake Karabakh. They used their military reforms to build a modern military. I don't see that happening yet with Ukraine. Yes, they're spending 7% of GDP, as Kurt pointed out. Great point. But also 70% of Ukrainian military spending goes on personnel. Okay, and that is a higher rate than what Greece spends, which is basically, if you follow those details on personnel, that goes in case of Greece, that goes into pensions. That doesn't go into tangible items for the military. So that brings me to the point of what I was wanted to emphasize today. In the Soviet Union, there was the old expression is, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Now, this was a term that was used, as many of you know from your classes in Marxist-Leninist theory, that this was the highest stage in the evolution of a society after it passed through the socialism stage. And this is where where communism came in, and this is where they use the phrase, well, we're moving towards the principles of Leninism, we're moving towards a process of communism. Why is this phrase important? Because that typifies the problem with Ukraine. The Ukrainian military continues to use those things. We pretend to make progress in NATO, okay, and we pretend to make progress, and everyone else pretends that we're making that progress, but no one is looking at the fine lines and the details of what they're doing. And that's just, the focus is, well, they seem to think that MAP and getting in membership in NATO will solve that, and that's all they want to talk about. They want to talk about the progress. Zelensky's comments and tweets saying, well, Joe Biden, where's our NATO membership? Where's the MAP plan? Okay, we want an answer and we want it now. Those types of statements are kind of reflective upon the problem with Ukraine, is that it keeps expecting that it's going to make that type of progress, and that without actually being able to make the progress that it wants in those areas. And in the same way falls with the US and the way the US is dealing with it. And I'll give you a case in point. The case in point is a June 7th statement by US DAS-DM at the Pentagon, Laura Cooper. And she was talking about the great progress that Ukraine is making. Now, she uses the very unique Pentagon term of force generation. The new system of command and control separates force generation from force employment. This is a core feature of Western military structures, okay? And I'm reading this language in a statement that was put out about the progress that Ukraine is making. And so I asked some friends who work in the Pentagon, can you please kind of make me translate that into what it means? And so basically it means that Ukraine is making with its recruiting, training, and equipping of land and air force special operations, that there's a separation of its armed forces between the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Oh, okay, great. Well, I guess Ukraine's becoming more like the Western military in the US. Force deployment is conducted for operational commands. So this is where Ukraine is being touted. Now, let's translate that into what's really happening in Ukraine. So on the one hand, Pentagon is praising the progress that's being made, but what does that mean in reality? Well, here's the reality, okay? The reality is that Ukraine special operation forces were subordinated to the Command and General Staff, General Kolmchak, or technically, at the time it was under Muzhenko. They separated because Ukraine reformers and those advocates in the West wanted Ukraine to become more like US Special Operations Command, okay? They wanted to become independent, not subordinated to the Ministry of Defense or the General Staff. So they went back from General Staff back to the Ministry of Defense. So great, that's great news. Ukraine Special Forces are highly capable. They've got a lot of training, but what does that mean in reality? What it means in reality is because Ukrainian Special Forces operate now as operational command, not separate with the General Staff is refusing to use them in military operations. So therefore, you have a military component of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the special operations, that because of this creation in paper and distinction that they have, they're not being used by the Ukrainian military in military operations, but they like to tout that. And then they postulate how the Ukraine Special Operations Forces are making progress and they're getting up to NATO standards. Well, that's great. But at the end of the day, if Ukraine can't integrate and use its special forces into warfighting capabilities, then how is that a deterrent effect? And this is the problem where I see, on the one hand, yes, it's very important for us to applaud what Ukraine is doing, but we got to hold their feet to the fire on what they're doing internally. Now, another case in point is the statements being made. And further, I just want to make one other further point. When I talk about deterrence effects, what we need to do, and then why I'm emphasizing this point is so important, is because the deterrence effects are I think that one of the best things the United States can do is to train Ukrainian special operation forces and create JTACs. JTACs are the joint tactical operations forces that operate in forward operating positions and call in airstrikes. These are the people with the JTACs. If we want to create a deterrence effect, we start training Ukrainian special forces to work and Ukrainian army as JTACs for forward air controllers in case there's a problem with the Russians, in case they break through at Kherson. And on paper, at least, there's a deterrence effect by the United States that says to the Russians, by developing a JTAC program working with Ukrainian military, it forces the Russians to realize that, hey, if we do something, US is prepared to act and operate. Then it tells another thing to the Ukrainian general staff, says, look, Ukrainian special forces in the US, they're training with them, and it forces them to start using them in a way that creates a deterrence effect. And that's very important in the overall scheme of things. So my problem is that the realities of what we have and what we say are very much distorted and not there. Case in point on the Ukrainian Navy. The Ukrainian Navy has been promised as a part of the package in the $150 million package that recently assigned to get 2 of the Mark 6 attack boats. Those Mark 6 attack boats have a deterrence effect. Why? First of all, the coastline is very much undefended, okay? Second, they're highly mobile and fast. They're equivalent to the US PT boats used by John F. Kennedy, PT 109, during the Pacific War. What the MK6s would do is it creates a deterrence effect. It disrupts Russian amphibious operations or attempts at operations. So they can be moved around. They can be moved from the Sea of Azov or moved from Odessa. They could be put on a railroad, moved around, and it gives them that deterrence effect. And most importantly, it disrupts Russian operational planning. And these are the types of things that we need to keep doing and keep emphasizing. But the problem here is that Minister of Defense Tehran, who I hear his job is on the line, and I hear there's some things going on within the Ministry of Defense that may see him lose his job. I hope it happens, because what he's doing is he's creating a shell game. He's creating the impression, for example, I met with the Ukrainian embassy recently, and they were talking about, oh, well, the MK6s are coming and Mosquito Fleet naval strategy is well advanced. Oh, well, really? And I was like, well, that's news to me. And so when I asked more of the specific details, the problem is that the Ministry of Defense is telling everyone, okay, and it's telling the public, it's telling Congress, oh, we're making great progress with the Mosquito Fleet, but they're not doing anything other than what the US is offering as a part of the package. Instead, what they're doing is, and I'll give you a case in point, is a recent naval deal that they signed. Okay, I'll wrap up. Mm-hmm. The recent naval deal that they've the recent naval deal that they signed with the British with the British Ministry of Defense has resulted. Okay, they signed this deal in March, and what they're doing, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, is signing deals, creating impression that they're doing something, but they're converting all this money towards corvette and naval programs that will take 10 to 20 years to develop. And instead of getting Western armament, they want to equip these with the Rhone equivalent of the anti-shipping missiles, the Neptune. And these weapons are not even in development. They want to create these ships and create a naval building program using Mykolaiv and create Ukrainian jobs. But the problem is the corruption element is being diverted, not for tangible military items. I'll stop there. Thank you for this opportunity. But again, I think that we have to hold their feet to the fire and focus on deterrence effects. And Ukraine has got to get its feet right and going in the right direction. And we're not holding them accountable.
Glenn, thank you very much. Your emphasis on reform is quite well taken. James, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
My cursor was not behaving.
Okay.
Thank you. William, Walter, Kurt, and Glenn, it's a pleasure seeing you again, and greetings to everyone from a very sunny afternoon in Tallinn. I thought I was going to be the Cassandra here, but Glenn has won that award. So I'm going to be much more shaded, and I'm going to talk in equal measure about the good, the not so good, and the bad. The good today is that the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces of Ukraine are capable institutions. Remember the baseline, please. Yanukovych and his two defense ministers ruined the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces. They did these things very competently and at Russia's behest. Petro Poroshenko rebuilt both of these institutions, but he compromised every enterprise, not only there, by his overbearing authority and his way of using it. Today, at last, there is a very capable defense policy department, which understands the imperative of reforming defense management. There are new people in it. It is energized, very active. It is working a lot. It is working on the management side alongside the Business School of Kiev Mohyla Academy. That is one. Second, very good fundamental documents have been published. I won't discuss which they are or the importance of having that work done. Ukraine has now adopted, after a long time, NATO defense capability concept, which means in many respects for the first time, they have a reliable means of both defining capability and measuring it. There has been a good structural reform of the general staff in line with NATO standards. NATO standards are spreading, especially at lower levels. I'll come back to the higher levels later. I would agree with what Glenn would say immediately, that a lot of this is simple mimicry, but a lot of it isn't. And finally, I would say that the effectiveness of the armed forces is incomparably better than it was in 2015. Even a year ago, certainly too, I would have said the major problem is a complete gap in mentality and not only experience between people on the front line, people actually committed to this war, and people who sit in headquarters. That gap is still there, but it has risen up the hierarchy, and it now appears above brigade level. So at brigade level and below, you now have commanders with real combat experience who are trusted by the people they command and who know what they are doing. The not so good. Personnel policy is in regression. Why? There is still no understanding, certainly no sufficient understanding of the importance of establishing a proper career structure and of understanding just what this means for the motivation and morale of people you want to attract and people you want to keep. Now, the retention levels are much higher than they were, but Ukraine is still losing 10% of servicemen a year, and a large proportion of these people are veterans, highly trained, experienced, capable people, and they are leaving because they are dissatisfied with conditions and where things are going. And by the way, a lot of money has been spent on these people. So this is also, there's a cost factor here. Second, procurement policy, which was already bad, is also in regression, if that's even possible. It's not only because vested interests want to continue stealing, but also for most of the people involved who are old guys, this is the system they know and understand, and they don't want to change it. Be in no doubt, it is still a Soviet system of defense procurement, and in today's conditions, it's become completely dysfunctional. Third, the well thought through naval policy and concept to 2035, which Glenn was alluding to, has gone into reverse and gone to the dogs. And I won't speculate or elaborate upon why. Now, the bad, and the bad is also ugly. The relationship between the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff has become not only dysfunctional, it has broken down. not only in NATO armed forces, defense systems, but in Russia as well, the functions of these two entities are very strictly demarcated. And not to demarcate them is almost by definition seen as anarchy, as anarchic. And at that level, that is what we have. Inside NATO armed forces, the Ministry of Defense is a civilian cabinet level institution. Of course, there are military officers inside it. It is responsible, has authority for defense policy, national defense strategy, defense management, and the management of resources. It has, on the other hand, no operational command or command authority over troops. That is the function of the general staff, the planning and the conduct and the command of operations. And in most general staffs also are the locus of analysis and military intelligence. In March 2020, President Zelensky put the cat amongst the pigeons and established a new post. He moved Ruslan Humchak from Chief of the General Staff to become a new Commander-in-Chief, raising all sorts of confusions about who is who. And what is now worse is that the Defense Minister, Andrei Taran, and Ruslan Humchak today each wish to be regarded as having ultimate seniority in both functions of minister and CGS. They do not even speak to one another. And recently, Humchak even initiated a lawsuit against Taran. The only person who can really change this is President Zelensky himself. And although I could speak at some length about his talents, one of his principal deficiencies, and it's very evident here, is that he is not a systemic thinker. He does not have that turn of mind. The importance of this distinction, this division of labor and of authority, has been explained to him patiently a number of times, and he simply doesn't get it. And no one else will have the authority in the end to do what is really necessary, because he has ultimate responsibility for all of this. So that is where we are. And there is an obvious requirement for allies to try to communicate these points without bureaucratic and technical jargon in human terms that not only President Zelensky, but politicians and a large number of other figures will understand. So that is the precarious balance we have at present. Thank you.
James, terrific. As always, your comments are trenchant and thought-provoking. Our final panelist is Alexander Gray. Alexander?
Thanks so much, Ambassador Courtney, and thanks to Walter and to Mykola for including me. And it's great to be here with such a distinguished group of experts. And I have the privilege now going last, so I get to look at everyone's remarks and kind of pick and choose the most trenchant comments. And I actually agree, a mix of agreement and disagreement with everyone. But I would probably start with where Ambassador Volker is. And having had the privilege of just coming back from Ukraine on an American Foreign Policy Council delegation just a couple of weeks ago, I'm particularly struck by the improvements that Ambassador Volker referred to in the capabilities of Ukraine's military from 2014. And I certainly also take Glenn's points about some of the challenges, and we can get to that. But I think from a U.S. policymaker standpoint, and one of the things that was very much apparent to me when I was in government was the misperceptions that continued to be throughout the U.S. system about where the U.S. military or the Ukrainian military stood today versus 2014. And I think the baseline needs to be, for the understanding of U.S. policymakers, dramatic improvements across the board with a lot still to be done. And I would point to particularly the capabilities that Ambassador Volker referred to, the ability to field combat-ready forces, particularly on the ground. I would point to morale having improved dramatically. I would point to some of the improvements in command and control. That's on the good end of the ledger. On the bad end of the ledger, a reserve system that is somewhat non-existent. We have to make dramatic improvements, and this is an area where the U.S. can be particularly helpful, I think, in helping get to a reserve capability that will allow Ukraine to surge forces in a crisis. I think Glenn's point that there is a focus probably unduly on platforms to the exclusion of doctrine and the exclusion of some of the frontline capabilities. I think that's absolutely true. The decision recently on counter UAS and some of the US commitment on additional counter UAS capabilities, I think that's absolutely critical and should be expanded. I think looking at some of the Ukrainian needs on the air defense side, both air to air, but I would also say ground to air. I think those are particularly poignant. I would even mention some areas, frontline, I would say combat trauma medicine techniques are an area where there's a lot of US expertise that could be brought to bear to assist the Ukrainians. So I think capability-wise, bottom line from my perspective, great progress from 2014 as a baseline, lots of gaps, lots that needs to be done, emphasis change from probably, and this goes to, I think, the ministry and the senior leadership of the ministry, both civilian and military, probably a change from pure focus on platforms to a more holistic approach on doctrine and thinking more broadly. I would also note on the naval side, I think everyone's touched on this, the naval side is an area where I think FMF and FMS could be particularly useful, and where we have a big opportunity. We've certainly done on the excess defense article side, and on the FMS side, there's a lot more we can do. And looking at the DoD's ability and Department of State to tap into that EDA program, I think that's an underutilized tool that we could have, particularly on the naval side. I want to take a moment and talk a little bit more about the defense industry side, which is an area I've spent a lot of time in the US. I think standing up the Ministry of Strategic Industries was an important contribution, and it was an important step in the right direction. What I see, though, is a lot of areas on the defense industrial base side where Ukraine needs to make strides. And there are a couple of ways that I think they could do that. One, the Soviet style of top-down industrial policy continues to be a hindrance for them. And I think there's something we dabble with in the US that I think might be a compelling way for them to approach it. Is there has to be an assessment from the ministry in consultation with the presidential office of where are the most essential industries, where are the most essential national resources, what are the key kind of components for holistic military success, identifying those, using the Ministry of Strategic Industries to think creatively about how to, if they don't exist, how to incentivize creating those, and if they do exist, how to ensure that those are functioning in a way that meets the basic defense needs of Ukraine. And I think the United States, actually, we've talked about FMS and FMF. I think on the defense industrial side, the US could be a much greater partner than it has been thus far. And that's not in the traditional area of actually, procurement. We're not going to be buying anything from Ukraine. There's not a lot, there's no, certainly I don't think there's a lot of synergy there. But what we can do, we have defense industrial base management tools, and we have defense industrial base expertise and how to handle that system deeply embedded in our system. So there may not be exact overlap and parallels, but some of the tools that we use at the Department of Defense, things like the Manufacturing Technology Program, ManTech, and things like the Defense Production Act, Title III, there are, I think, those are templates that the Ministry of Strategic Industries could use as scalpels to promote key capabilities that really should be internal to Ukraine. And I think getting away from some of the either over-reliance on old Soviet kit and old Soviet industrial policy, and also over-reliance on foreign sourcing, and identifying what those key capabilities are, and then looking at modern defense industrial based management tools to get to cultivate those capabilities. I think that's something where we should have a much greater US-Ukraine cooperation, and that's something that we raised on our trip to Kyiv, and I think should be a major part of the discussion going forward. And then I would just I would make a quick comment about, because I know we were tasked with looking at doctrine as well. I would make a quick comment about kind of overarching national security doctrine, and then I'd be very interested in hearing people's questions and what the rest of the panel has to say. Thinking about doctrinally, I think that my understanding of how Ukraine is thinking about its defense capabilities continues to be very much focused on how can they continue to expand what the U.S. is going to be providing, and that's an important component. And I'm a big proponent of FMS and FMF. And I'm a big proponent of finding additional ways for us to have a robust defense relationship, and as I said, a robust defense industrial based management relationship, and lending that expertise. But I also think there needs to be a pretty significant rethink of Ukraine's institutional mentality as to how much of its defense capability is going to be generated domestically versus overseas. And really, I think in order to have the type of inherent domestic capability that's going to allow them to not just defend their current territory and defend their sovereignty, but make the type of forward-looking investments that they're really going to need in the coming decade. The mentality's got to shift, and it has to be a much more domestic focus. It's got to be, how do we use our relationships with the United States and with others to build the inherent capability to be much more self-sufficient? And I think there's certainly an FMS and an FMF and an industrial based management component of that, but that's got to be somewhat of a Band-Aid moving into a midterm to longer term domestic capability. And so that's a major, I think should be a major focus. And just the last thing I'd say, and I'm not sure this has been touched on in the context of strategic industries, we have to be encouraging Ukraine from an American perspective to think about their relationship, not just with the United States and with Europe and how they're handling the adversarial relationship with Russia, but we have to be talking to them openly and from a position of candor about the relationship with China. And I think it's going to be very difficult for the US and Ukraine to have a long-standing partnership for the decades ahead if we're not being entirely candid about our concerns on China's influence in the industrial base and in Ukraine. And one thing I would say is one of the successes, I don't think we're ready to call it a complete success, but one area of success in the previous US administration in which I served was, I think we had the beginnings of a candid conversation about some of the Chinese investment in the Ukrainian defense industry. I think that the Ukrainians were very receptive to that conversation. I think more needs to be done there. I also think that conversation, as we think about strategic industries holistically and broadly, needs to be extended to infrastructure. And as One Belt, One Road becomes an area of deep focus for the Chinese and it expands into Ukraine and Eastern Europe more broadly, the US needs to be very candid about how that type of investment impacts us and how it impacts our strategic view of the relationship with Kyiv. So I would highly recommend to anyone who is speaking to the government of Ukraine, who is advising them, or anyone from the Ukrainian government who's listening, that having an open and honest dialogue on the question of US-China relations or China-Ukraine relations and China's investment in strategic industries, that has to be on the front burner of any dialogue with the United States. Thank you.
Alexander, that's terrific. That's a very important point. Let me encourage everyone to think about questions. You can put them in the chat box, or if you like to ask them orally, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. So think about those. First, before we go to Q&As, let me ask if the panelists have any comments on other panelists' comments that they would like to make briefly. Okay, James and then Glenn. James?
I would like to say, consistent with the point I was making and Glenn was making separately, the next time a delegation, defense delegation from Ukraine turns up in a NATO capital, instead of giving them the usual lecture full of boltovnya and going through a laundry list of all the wonderful things we are doing, what they need to do is talk to senior people in that country's defense system about what their job is, how they understand it, and how they do it. Doing that can sometimes be a revelation. I could tell you stories of my own where this has been done with that effect, but I won't. But I just put that on the table. We have a communications problem that we underestimate. All of this in the end is about cultural change, changing the culture of an institution. And that has to be approached in a very different way from the normal business of support and assistance.
Okay, Glenn?
Glenn, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. When I talk about deterrence effects, there really has to be, some key areas where we follow up and hold their feet to the fire. Case in point, we saw the arms depot explosions, first in Czech Republic, then we saw the problems in Bulgaria, then we saw a series of ammo dump explosions inside Ukraine. Okay, Ukraine, we need to know, and we need to know where they stand on their abilities to produce ammunition and how much their stocks and supplies are, and their ability to protect that. My impression is, and especially with the 152 millimeters, with the artillery shells that they produce, they have said that they've built the plant, they're producing them. Some people really doubt whether that capability now exists or not. But these are the type of hard questions that we have to follow up and find out where they are, because we don't want to have a shooting war and then suddenly the US is all over Europe trying to find extra ammunition and supplies to help Ukraine meet its ammunition shortages. We all know what happened in World War I in Russia with its ammunition shortages. So there's an issue there. The second point, Harris radios. Where are the Harris radios we sent? Apparently, if you talk to many people on the front lines, they don't even use Harris radio. They don't even know how to use or operate them. The Ukrainian military gets these radios, and because they don't know how to use them, they stick them in a warehouse somewhere, and these guys on the front lines don't know how to use them. So there's encryption keys or certain things with that, but we never ask. And that's the problem. The same way with the ambulances that the Humvees that we send them. They're converted into private vehicles, escorts for the generals. They don't even use them as ambulances. So that is the type of thing. The other aspect, May 2020, Zelensky signs a decree on creating a territorial defense system, okay? And so here we are in May with the largest Russian military buildup ever in deployment, 100,000 men against Ukraine. Okay, and I'm asking my Ukrainian friends, where is the territorial defense? Have they activated the reserve system? The answer is no, we haven't, okay? So you're facing this existential threat to the state. You have a territorial defense system in place, but you're not calling up reserves. This is the type of thing. And what was baffling me was I had friends from Belarus that were called up in their own reserve system doing active duty in the military forces. So if a country of 10 million in Belarus is calling up a reserve system, where the heck is Ukraine when it's facing an existential crisis? These are the types of things that we don't hold their feet to the fire for. And in case, and I'll give you a case, another fourth, the last point was the whole episode of debacle with Bulgaria and the spy scandal. Here you have Bulgarian air. I know this doesn't apply to Ukraine, but my point is that the U.S. doesn't follow up. Here they are fixing and repairing. The Russian air crews are repairing their MiGs next door to where the Bulgarian F-16s are operating. I mean, Russian crews operating on the same tarmac where Bulgarian F-16s are operating. Come on, guys, where's the Pentagon? Who's paying attention? I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Walter Dursko. Has the Ukrainian military adapted to Western-style fast response tactics in the battlefield instead of the old Soviet battalion-focused slow movement tactics? James would like to respond to that.
I want to be naughty and slightly change the question. The real concern I have is whether they have adapted to Russian tactics, whether they have drawn the right conclusions and have the right operational concepts for dealing with an enemy that now pursues war as high intensity combined arms conflict on a highly fluid battlefield. This means maneuver warfare. And Ukrainian armed forces have not been training for that until very recently. I'm not saying there's no progress, but basically they have been training for positional warfare. And all you need to say is that you could have the best trained troops with the best possible equipment. And if they are in the wrong place, it is a wasted, effort. So the enemy is what matters most. That is the most important baseline. And the progress that has occurred, I think, is will not be seen as at all sufficient if a real emergency arises and a serious military escalation takes place. The best that I think Ukraine can hope for, and it is a lot, is deny Russia not only a deniable victory, but a very quick victory, and ensure that it's going to be extremely messy. That is a significant deterrent, but it is not where Ukraine needs to be.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panelists? Okay, we don't have any questions that I've seen so far. There was one that was posted briefly and then dropped down. I can't remember who posted it, but the question was, does the Ministry of Defense need a general overhaul of some kind? Would anyone like to comment on that? Yes, Alexander.
I think one of the other panelists made an important point about civil-military relations, and what struck me was the apparent continued dominance of both uniformed officers and recently retired uniformed officers over the policymaking apparatus at the ministry, and that's obviously, I think, consistent with most post-Soviet countries, and I think consistent with many parts of the world. But I do think over time, as we think about what a more developed the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense looks like, and areas in which we can be a positive value add in terms of mentoring and in terms of institutional assistance, I think a conversation about better civil military best practices, I think that could be a very useful addition to what we're imparting in our relationships. And that means that having a broader defense liaison discussion, and this is where I think the defense industrial based discussion can be very useful as well, because that's a discussion that's certainly well beyond just the uniform military, that brings in a lot of the US Defense Department components that have a significant civilian component, that brings in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So I think the more that we show a kind of diversified civil military framework, I think that's really positive for the discussion and for the development and evolution of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense.
Okay, I think we're at the end.
No,
Walter?
Kurt Volker had a stick.
Sorry, Kurt. Yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to make an additional point following on some things that came out of Mr. Jurkiw's question. Because the assumption is that the West knows how to do it best and Ukraine needs to adopt the Western practices. Sometimes it's the other way around, that the Ukrainians have learned a lot in direct combat with Russian forces that we have not learned. And so there are tactical benefits that I think the US is deriving and can derive from learning from the Ukrainian experiences, whether it's in counter sniper or whether it is in electronic warfare. And it is very much a two-way street. And I think it can be even more of a two-way street.
Thank you, Kurt.
Ambassador Courtney, I wasn't going to intrude a question, but I think that one of the dimensions that we haven't touched on, because you've touched, the four experts have really shown their colors on this one, but we haven't touched on a key thing, and Ben Hodges brought it up, that if things get hot this summer, that might be a component that we have to look at. Not just we've been talking about land and sea, but the air component. And I was wondering whether our experts might be able to comment on whether Ukraine is sufficiently prepared if, God forbid, Putin decides to do something different than what he promised. Whether the Ukrainians have a sufficient air component or even plans, or have talked about an air component, including the very good use of Turkish drones that we've seen in Azerbaijan. And Glenn, you've often talked about it very eloquently. So this one's to Ambassador Volker, to Alex, to Jim, and to you, Glenn. Do you think that the air component is sufficient in Ukraine?
Go ahead.
I'll just jump in and say very quickly, not at all. I think that we have been lucky that Russia wants to maintain deniability in its aggression against Ukraine. So it has not launched an air campaign against Ukraine yet. But if it did, Ukraine would be woefully under-equipped to deal with an air campaign. And so now is the time that we should be helping Ukraine develop a serious air defense capability.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My point is that the part of the problem since the Soviet demise has been that the U.S. military industrial capabilities for air defense have only been focused on Patriots. So there's no interim level, which has created a whole problem for Turkey with its purchase of the S-400, is that there's no mid-level areas for air defense. And so Ukraine has this major problem with first of all, shortage of spare parts for the Bukes. Mm-hmm. So the second point
Right.
air defense that they created and that they used to punish the Russians in Idlib. Then they used them in case of Karabakh, but Armenia had no Air Force, so they didn't have to resort to that. I agree with what Kurt said. In the gray area, I don't think the Russians are going to use their Air Force because of the visible propaganda effect of them using it. So there's a certain deniability capability that they're worried about, but it's something that we need to fill the gap, but we don't have it. So we have to think creatively. But again, it seems like all throughout between the Baltic and the Black Sea that the Turks are stepping up to the game, providing defense equipment, even to Norway. Norway is now talking about purchasing Turkish drones. So, they're a game changer, but they don't solve the strategic problems. But air defense is a big question, no doubt.
James?
Yes, there's a paradox here. When Russia threw its combined arms maneuver battalions into the fray, first in late 2014 and then again in 2015, they weren't interested in deniability then. They were rescuing their militia forces who were being slaughtered. They did not use air because they didn't need to. Because the Ukrainian armed forces against those Russian battalion maneuver groups were so outclassed they were overrun and, of course, in both Ilovaisk and Debaltseve, massacred. Here's the paradox. When Ukraine reaches a point where the capability of its armed forces is such that they pose a convincing deterrent against a capable, conventional Russian military assault with all the advanced technology that Russia disposes of, then that gap in air defenses is going to be very, very telling. But then at the same time, Russia will face a dilemma because Glenn is right. If you commit air power, you're in another ballgame. It's a different type of war. The stakes so clearly are the survival of Ukrainian statehood. And no one in the Kremlin or in the Russian Ministry of Defense can assume NATO and all NATO allies are just going to sit still and passively witness this. So we're into different territory. But that issue is going to have to come onto the agenda, paradoxically, when Ukraine makes progress. And the question is, where are the resources for this going to come from? As well as the thinking, because as I believe Kurt mentioned, the NATO has not fully sorted out. I know in the Baltic states, we haven't fully sorted out just what type of integrated air defense force is needed against the Russian threat we are currently facing. It's a major gap for all of us.
Yes. James, thank you. We have 5 minutes left. So we need to ask panelists about the grade. Walter, is there just one grade from each panelist?
Yeah, it depends on whether they want to. Yesterday, the panelists decided to break it along the suggested issues, but here I suspect that they can do it either over the 4 different issues, how they would grade it, or just simply a general grade for an overall grade. It depends on how the panelists and graders want it. We've allowed both.
Okay, let me read the 4 criteria: professionalized armed forces, modernized military industrial complex, developed national security doctrine, and reliable allies. So for the panelists, please submit 1 grade or 4 if you prefer. James first.
Well, I submitted 2 because I was factoring an A- from all the things that I said were good, a C- from all the things which I said are not good, and then an F, a big F, for the last part, because that is fundamental. And so if I could submit a grade, that would be B+ over F.
So
I'll leave it. I will.
among the 4
As a good academic.
among the 4 criteria, James, where would the F
No, it's
apply?
fair. The F would apply to not understanding the fundamentals and the critical point about having an integrated defense system. There's one issue we didn't discuss. I don't want to discuss it. I was addressing it for 25 years now in Ukraine. The fact that there's too much focus on MOD armed forces and not the rest of the security structure, beginning with all of those forces now subordinated to Avakov's Ministry of the Interior and the National Guard, and pulling all of that together.
All right. Thank you, Walter. I'll leave you to figure out how to balance out those 2 grades. Kurt, your grade?
Thanks. Armed forces, I would give them a B+. Defense industry, say a C-. National security doctrine, maybe a C. And reliable allies, maybe a B-.
Glenn?
Yeah, sorry. I'll give them overall C-. Tehran has to go. Navy gets an F.
Alexander?
Alexander.
Yeah, overall, I would say B- with, I would say it would be even lower if we were to take reliable allies into account. Other than the United States, I'm not sure there is such a thing in this context, and that's always dependent on different factors. So I think the bright spots are professionalization of the military, particularly between 2014 and now, if that's the comparison. Defense industries definitely, I think, moving in the right direction with a lot of work to be done. And doctrine, I think a lot of work to be done.
Great, thank you. And in the 1 minute left in our time slot, let me just mention one issue. Some of you have probably seen various think tank reports in Washington that relate to Ukraine and Ukraine security. There are think tank debates. One of them recently came out with a report which really suggests again that the West should let Ukraine go, and just say flatly to the Russians that Ukraine will never be part of NATO. It's important to realize that these kinds of reports seem to have almost no resonance in the politics of Washington. Bipartisan support in Congress for Ukraine security is really quite strong. There are some people who you might consider not so strong on defense as others, but bipartisan support for Ukraine is quite strong. So I would not get too concerned about some of these think tank reports. Thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to all the participants. And Walter,
Thank you, Bill. You did a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Glenn, you actually took the words out of my mouth. Ambassador Courtney, as always, wonderful work as chair, and as expected, the stellar performances from each one of our panelists and graders, better than C-SPAN, and in fact, better than CNN or Fox or the others. Bravo, and again, bravo. Each of you, Bill, Kirk, Glenn, James, and Alex, thank you for this incredibly informative session. With Friends of Ukraine like each of you, Ukraine truly has an extremely important resource in the security field. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. So thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
And now to the last and equally critical session. It's the session that deals with Ukraine's present state of social cohesion and sense of national identity. Again, I cannot begin to stress how important that is. In fact, it's in some sense tied, the internal processes of Ukraine are tied to its security issues. And so again, I call upon a senior U.S. diplomat, a distinguished senior U.S. diplomat, Ambassador Roman Popodyuk, and the four panelists, Otec Pawlo Lutsenko, Pani Oleksandra Matvichuk, and two returning graders. I highly appreciate their presence, Ambassador Roman Vashchuk and Professor Alexander Motin. With no further ado, we have a busy schedule, but I think this panel needs that full measure of time. I hand it over to Ambassador Popodyuk. Roman, thank you for taking this on again and again and again.
Okay, thank you very much, Walter. I appreciate being invited once again to these very important conferences, and I commend you for all the good work that you and the others associated with the conferences have done over the years. As everyone knows, the session that we're dealing with is the issue of social cohesion. It is customary to view national security in terms of armed forces, military strength, alliances, and things of that nature. However, an important component of national security also involves social cohesion. That is the dynamics of a society, how it interacts, how the population interacts, and how the population views the state. So our session this morning will view the dynamics of Ukrainian society with a particular focus on three areas, namely ethnicity, religion, and national identity. And we do have a distinguished set of panelists joining us. You mentioned their names. Let me just go briefly over them once again. Joining us from Kiev is Ms. Alexandra Matvichuk, who's from the Center for Civil Liberties, a leading human rights organization in Ukraine that focuses on judicial and legal reforms, as well as in educating the public. We have Professor Alexander Motel from Rutgers University, a political scientist and leading expert on Ukraine and prolific writer on the subject of Ukrainian issues. And we also have Reverend Father Pavlo Prosenko from the Ukraine Armed Forces Chaplain Corps, who also is a priest in the Luhansk Diocese of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And finally, we have joining us Ambassador Roman Vashchuk, who is a veteran Canadian diplomat and served as Canada's ambassador to Ukraine from 2014 through 2019. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. Our time is limited, as Walter likes to remind us. I would ask each panelist to devote about 12 minutes to their opening comments so that we have enough time to do two things at the end. Number one, open the floor to questions and a discussion, and also do the grading system that Walter has in these conferences. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is go in the order that I introduced each of the panelists. And Alexander, if you'll be kind enough to start the session off, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. I am a human rights defender, and I will speak about the topics of social cohesion in Ukraine, not on the researcher point of view, but from my practical experience according to international standard of human rights. And I would like to start this topic with a very important historical moment of Ukraine. I mean, a revolution of dignity, which was conducted 7-8 years ago. Because the revolution of dignity shows a model of political nation and a clear sign that Ukrainians have abilities to build a bridge between different groups and to unite it for achieving a common goal for the country. For that time, I was a coordinator of Euromaidan SOS, and we brought up several thousands of people to provide legal and other aid for persecuted protesters. And every day, hundreds and hundreds of people who were beaten, arrested, kidnapped, tortured, accused and fabricated criminal or administrative charges pass through our care. And 70% of people who joined to the initiative have no civil experience of participation in civil life before, but they couldn't stay indifferent in that important time. But what is the more important, that they are representative of different religion, different ideology. They were the representative of marginalized groups in Ukrainian society, and all of them work together in one initiative and provide the good examples of social trust and social cohesion. And also what we have observed from the times of Euromaidan, the attempt to demonstrate Ukrainians like a nation of extremists or like some nation of radicals, which brought up roots from the Russian propaganda since the Maidan time. And for sure, we have a lot of problems in Ukraine, and discrimination is one of them. But when we speak about such kind of problems, it's better to rely upon the human rights report, and was done by many years by Congress on National Minorities in Ukraine, Kharkiv Human Rights Group, Ukrainian Helsinki Union, and other, but not Russian propaganda. Because when we speak about such kind of problems of non-tolerance, of discrimination, we need to understand the general context of this problem. And I would like to tell that when we speak about the general context, we speak first of all about two things. The first thing is that the Ukrainian state institution is still in the process of reformation, and they are weak. And that's why any kind of violence and dangerous, like violence against activists or violence which we observe on general criminal violence, or like violence against some Roma minorities, etc. It's dangerous because unreformed properly state institution couldn't prevent it and stop it. And this is one of the context which we have to think about. And second context is the war, because in order to stop this process of democratic transformation, Russia started a war against Ukraine and occupied part of Ukrainian territories, Crimea and Donbas. And it's very natural for any nation in the war. So it's not like Ukrainian particularities, but it's natural for any country in the war that the temporary tolerance to violence is increasing. And this is a general context in which we have to think about problems with discrimination or connected with this problem, others related problems. And this, when we speak about this problem, we have to say that despite this, we have no far-right party in parliament. And Russia propaganda tried to show Ukraine like a country where there are a lot of fascists, but it's good to mention that when we speak about political life, Germany has alternative in the parliament. Hungary has Jobbik. When we now read the experts about France's future president election, we see that Marine Le Pen has a very big chance to be elected for current moment, but once again, Ukraine has no far-right party in the parliament. But a lot of gossip, a lot of claims, a lot of demands, and a lot of Russian propaganda issue. If we speak about problem with the trust, social trust, and problem with social cohesion, we have to understand that the root of this problem are in our historical past, because when we were part of Soviet Union, it was very dangerous for survival to trust to each other. It was very dangerous to speak freely. You can be jailed for any word which you is unloyal for authorities. And this is a huge historical trauma. And so the social trust now we have to build in country which for years get used to the point that if you want to survive, you have not to trust to each other. And we need to understand this historical context, which has reflected to our current days. But we have a good positive trends in Ukraine. And as I told 7 years ago, Revolution of Dignity underlines a clear vector of development of the country. And the driver for social cohesion in Ukraine is civil society. And when we speak about civil society and the attempt to build a bridge between different groups and unite the country, I would like to mention two main tasks which we need to achieve. The first task connected with the civil society ecosystem. What do I mean? According to social survey, civil society, civil organizations, volunteers movement has the most level of trust in comparison with the state and other public institutions. But we are powerful but fragmented. Anti-corruption organizations work on their agenda. Human rights organizations work on their own agenda. If you speak, and if you ask ecological leaders, please provide a name of trade union leaders, they don't know each other. So we need to build joint channel of mobilization. We need to create this civil society ecosystem, which we need to unite our agendas in one civil society consolidated agenda in order to import it to the general population and to the political parties. Unfortunately, it wasn't happened in past president and parliamentary elections. And now I see a good trend that different parts of civil society start to communicate with other and start to understand that we had to go beyond our narrow topics and to think jointly about how we have to make the frame for future development. And second task, which we have between civil society in regard to build the social trust and to increase the social cohesion, is also a problem of a gap between civil society and ordinary people. According to social survey, in 2013, we have 8% of people who said that they invest their private time, resources, knowledge, skills into some public goals. They are not always members of civil society organizations, different people, but their responsibility is going on beyond their own life or life of their family, and they invest their skills for public goals to the different level on their town, level on their region or national level. In 2014, the number of such people, and I refer to social survey of Fund of Democratic Initiative, was the same at 8%. And then from year to year, we see the same number, which is not increasing, for my huge surprise. And in 2019, we had the first decline of the number of people who say that they are active in civil life to the 7.5%. And first, when I saw these numbers, I couldn't believe, because it was the first year of war, and I saw a huge volunteers movement. And then the head of this Fund of Democratic Initiative, Irina Viteshkina, told that it's because the people who were active become active 3 times more. And I looked how I work, how work a lot of my colleagues, and I understood that she was right. So we need to change our model of work, and we need not only to focus on the international community, but we need to be focused on our own Ukrainian people and to build a connection between each other, to involve them. We have not to work in our comfort civil society ghetto, but to increase it and to provide a possible mechanism for ordinary people to join to different initiatives, human rights initiative, anti-corruption initiative, ecological initiative, etc. So it's the second important task, which I believe will increase social trust, to build the bridges between different groups and increase the social protection. And I will finish, because my time is running up, for the point that there are a lot of discussion about reforms in Ukraine. Do this glass of reform is full empty or full, or half empty or half full? But the question is not, is it? The question is, do we have in this glass enough water in order to make a quantitative leap and to escape from the zone of transition in which Ukraine stuck for decades? And I really believe that the energy of civil society will provide us such kind of chance. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Matvichuk, for that outline on the development of civic society in Ukraine. I think you make some very interesting points in terms of broadening and strengthening civic society. But a key takeaway, I think, that a lot of our viewers should realize is the legacy, the old Soviet legacy, as you mentioned, that has hampered a lot of the development along these lines. But that Ukraine is moving past that, as you outlined, in terms of broadening and strengthening civic society. So thank you very much for your comments. What I'd like to do now is turn to Professor Motyl. Alexander, if you're ready, please.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to focus primarily on the 2 issues of a common history and a common future, as outlined in the instructions. This is a curious kind of topic, because unlike the ones that we've talked about in the past, especially those relating to economy and security, there you had something in the nature of a model to which Ukraine could aspire. And it was more or less easy to say, well, it's deficient with regard to A, B, and C, and doing well on regard to D, E, and F, and so on and so forth. When it comes to questions of national identity, there is no obvious model in the world, nor is there even one theoretically, at least as I was thinking about it. Sure, we don't expect all the people of a country to agree 100% on every single issue. That's, first of all, that would be weird. That would probably be impossible and possibly very undesirable. We want some kind of contention. So the question isn't, is there dissension? Is there lack of consensus? But how much lack of consensus is there? And I would imagine that we could probably agree that if the society is polarized right down the middle and everybody disagrees fundamentally on absolutely everything, that's probably bad. But if you have certain minorities who disagree, majorities who agree, well, that seems like business as usual, at least in the contemporary world. Anyway, I say this because as I was thinking about these issues, I couldn't help but keep in mind the experience of Western countries, and I'll come back to them in a second, especially the United States, which, as all of you know, is in the throes of various memory wars, history wars, and of course, all of those are effectively identity wars. So whatever it is that Ukraine has experienced over the last 20, 30 years has come home to roost, as it were, not just in the United States, arguably also in Canada, and certainly in much of Western Europe as well. Anyway, it's traditional to view the distinctions within Ukraine as running along an east-west divide. And in the more simplistic notions, there is a monolithic West and a monolithic East. The Dnipro River is this kind of dividing line, and everybody to the west of the line agrees on everything, and everybody to the east of the line agrees on everything, and that these two positions are in some ways irreconcilable. That may be true for the far west and the far east. I'm inclined to think that most people in Lviv really do disagree with most people in the Donbass on most issues, perhaps not on everything, but on most issues. But that's just another way of saying that California and Maine are also in very different spheres. And the important thing isn't so much the extremes, or here I mean geographic extremes, not so much political or ideological ones, but the fact that in between the extremes, there is a whole gradation of views on a variety of issues. And this has been documented by all sorts of public opinion surveys. There's agreement amongst many Ukrainians about certain issues. And then the disagreements and agreements, they vary, again, to put it simplistically, on this kind of east-west spectrum. Or if you like, you can add a north-south dimension to this as well. But it's obvious, the point is that there are shades of disagreement, shades of agreement, which makes for a kind of homogeneous analysis, which makes such an analysis somewhat difficult to provide. I'm going to draw upon a recent study, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with it, to make the points that I was going to make. And this is a publication called From Memory Wars to a Common Future, Overcoming Polarization in Ukraine, published by the London School of Economics, and specifically its so-called ARENA program. And what they did is they divided Ukraine into what they call 4 segments. The first is urban, young, educated in the West. The second is urban, young, educated in the East and South. The third is rural, old in the West. The fourth is rural, old in the East and South. And as expected, right, there is indeed an East-West divide of sorts, again, of sorts, with regard to particular issues. And let me just read this to you. Ukrainians in West Ukraine and Kiev were more supportive of Ukrainian nationalist partisans in World War II, more likely to support the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution, more likely to have a strong sense of pride in being Ukrainian, and more likely to hold Russia responsible for the current war in Eastern Ukraine. None of that's surprising. We knew that 10 years ago, we knew that 6 years ago, we know that today. What is striking, though, is that they are more supportive. It's not that it's homogeneously supportive, but more supportive, which is to say that there are also individuals to the east and to the south who are also supportive of these positions. They just happen to be more or less in the minority. Well, that suggests that there is a bit of a split of sorts, but as I said, it's not a surprising split. But at the same time, we need to temper that with the various statistics produced by a variety of polling institutions in Ukraine, Razumkov, Democratic Initiatives, and others, which show that, you know, the vast majority of Ukrainians, and here we're talking about 80, 90%, think of themselves as Ukrainian, recognize Ukraine as their state, as their homeland, are proud to be Ukrainian in some fashion or other. In a recent poll by the Democratic Initiatives, they came up with a number that 71% of the population believe that Russia and Ukraine are at war with each other. So in other words, it's not just separatists, and so on and so forth. So there is, again, one has to temper these findings with the realization that there's a kind of overarching agreement on certain basics, which is important because that wouldn't necessarily have been the case 30 years ago, and certainly not even 10 years ago, but arguably is the case today. But going back to that ARENA report, what is striking about that is that after having established the fact that there is this division, more or less, regarding national issues relating primarily to the past, this is important to keep in mind, primarily to the past, there is also there's also significant agreement between the urban young educated segment in the East and the urban young educated segment in the West on such issues as liberalism, personal individual development, tolerance of minorities, multiculturalism, blah, blah, blah. In other words, both these groups tend to be more liberal. And again, we expect this. Since they're urban and educated, none of this is terribly surprising, but they tend to be more liberal, they tend to be more individualistic, they tend to be more concerned with multiculturalism, diversity, human rights, and issues of those kinds. And hence, they also have a somewhat similar image and vision of what Ukraine should be like in the future. By the same token, the rural, less educated, older populations tended to be less liberal, less oriented towards human rights and so on, which again isn't terribly exciting. We know that from our own experience as well. So what we have here, interestingly enough, is a whole series of cross-cutting cleavages, to use a social science term. It is not the fact that everybody in the West is young, liberal, and nationalist, and everybody in the East is old, illiberal, and authoritarian. Rather, you've got a whole mixture of stuff going on within the country. And what is significant is that the values that we would probably consider to be most appealing, namely, I'm just going to call them liberal values for the sake of simplicity, are in fact the values of the future. Because these are the values that are embraced by the young urban professionals, as opposed to the rural older people whose importance in the political arena as well as in the ideological arena will obviously dwindle with time, whereas the importance of the views held by the young urban professionals will increase over time as they become older, assuming, of course, that they retain a commitment to this. That may be a bit of an assumption, but probably not too much of an assumption. All of this then leads me to the conclusion, which is also made by the report, and this is a conclusion, however, that I came to independently of this particular report, namely that Ukraine really resembles many Western countries. It's not all that different when it comes to national identity. I just read today in Die Welt, the University of Münster published an article, published a survey of German attitudes towards national identity. And apparently there's a significant divide between 20% on one extreme and 15% on the other. And then of course, there's roughly 65% caught in the middle. This brings to mind a public opinion survey done by the Pew Charitable Trust about 2-3 years ago, whereby they established that people on the extreme right in the US are about 20-25% of the population. Extreme left is about 15%. And then you've got 60-65, let's call them the silent majority in the middle. There are similar surveys that show that similar kinds of tendencies exist in many West European countries as well. So Ukraine seems to fit into the mainstream. Not all that unusual. Now, again, I don't know whether that means Ukraine should therefore be lauded, or whether everybody should be criticized for having these sorts of splits. But it seems to me that Ukraine isn't all that different when it comes to these sorts of issues from many of these West European and other states. Now, that's the good news. Let me end on one bit of, well, sort of semi-good news. There is one difference, of course. When West Germans, or, for instance, support the AfD, or when the French support Marine Le Pen, or whether Americans support white supremacist groups of one kind or other, none of those, all of those, of course, put in question the values and the norms and the institutions of the state. But if these groups were to triumph, they would not put into question the existence of the state. It would be France, but a different France. It would be Germany, but a different Germany. It would be in America, but a different America. The difference in the Ukrainian case is that those individuals with, let's call it a more lenient or perhaps even a more positive attitude towards Russia, because ultimately that's what we're talking about. In a way, that's kind of the proxy here, isn't it? They are not just questioning Ukraine's move westward, Ukraine's adoption of democratic norms, market norms, and things of that sort. In effect, they're arguably questioning Ukraine's very existence. And that, of course, is a concern. Fortunately, my guess is that that segment is probably about 20–25% of the population. And to speak in terms of, half-filled cups and half-empty cups, that means that 75 to 80 are in agreement that Ukraine should exist. But 20% is still 20%, and that's perhaps 15% too many. Thank you.
Professor, thank you very much for that cogent analysis. I think your presentation undermines for our viewers a lot of the stereotypes that people have held of Ukraine, that there's a clear-cut division between East and West and along ethnic lines. It's obviously a lot more complicated the way you presented it. So thank you very much for that cogent and concise presentation. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions on this. Let's move on to our next presenter, the Reverend Father Prosenko. Father.
Вельми шановне панство, вітаю. Моє бачення соціальної згуртованості українців – це бачення священника, який має парафію в Луганській області, служить військовим капеланом в Збройних силах України і провадить дослідницьку роботу як аспірант. Тобто це три погляди на дійсність життя українця, або чому так швидко змінюється наша національна свідомість. Як змінює себе моя нація, завдяки чому, розпочавши службу в військовим капеланом в 24-му штурмовому батальйоні «Айдар», я був готовий побачити в особовому складі ніби зменшену копію національно свідомої частини населення України. Адже випадкові люди тут не затримуються. Це сувора війна. На сході України ми щороку традиційно у найвідповідальніших гарячих точках, а вояки Айдару – це професійні військовослужбовці, які добровільно прийшли воювати за незалежність України. Різні за національністю, мовою, ставленням до релігії. Звісно, для мене найбільш зручно охарактеризувати військовослужбовців саме за їх релігійною ознакою. Адже в Айдарі я зустрів представників всіх трьох основних християнських конфесій – мусульман, юдеїв, прихильників шаманізму та навіть Російської православної церкви в Україні. Адже віра на війні необхідна. Віросповідною традицією і релігією тут ти можеш цілком відрізнятися від усіх інших. Та бойове завдання у вас одне. Ритм життя на війні, він загострює твої людські якості, впливає на відносини, а відповідальність за досягнення цілі вже скріплюється пам'яттю полеглих побратимів. Тож я на власні очі побачив, як цей практичний комунізм зріс у стійку тактику підкресленої релігійної терпимості між неоязичником і християнином, між мусульманином і юдеєм, між вірянами всіх християнських конфесій. Адже спільна загроза об'єднує всіх, тебе і твого побратима в батальйоні, мирних жителів прифронтових районів, всього населення України. Спільна загроза кардинально змінила не тільки свідомість військовослужбовців, вона змінила життя мільйонів українців, як фізично, так і ментально. Адже відбулася концентрація на агресорі, а не на міжнаціональному чи релігійному протистоянні. Саме такою є сьогодні спільна віра всього військового з'єднання «Айдар». Як капелана мене, відверто кажучи, більше засмучує, власне, низький рівень віри в Бога у особового складу. Адже це штурмовий батальйон, він складається із солдатів, які воюють, стріляють, гинуть. Недостатня увага держави до капеланської служби – це ще одна нагальна проблема. І дуже схоже, що вона продиктована недалекоглядністю військового керівництва, є відлунням радянської армії. З погляду парафіяльного священника найсхіднішої парафії Луганської області, де до кордону з Росією лише 30 кілометрів, моя оцінка щодо змін національної свідомості більш ніж мільйона українців, які лишаються без належної уваги в цій прифронтовій зоні. Війна насправді змінила цих людей. їх світогляд, переконання, відчуття національної ідентичності. Більшість тутешнього населення традиційно сповідує себе християнами, а православна релігія, як відомо, є націєутворюючою для українців. Тому на прикладі змін у релігійному житті Луганщини я прослідковую і зміни в національній свідомості її мешканців. До початку російської агресії на сході України на цих територіях монопольно діяли структури Російської православної церкви, УПЦ МП, які є релігійними осередками імперської ідеології руського міра. Чисельність їх храмів перевищила 400 супроти одного храму Православної церкви України. І це при тому, що більшість населення області – українці. Причиною тому є бездіяльність центральної влади, яка приховано дозволяла проросійським силам штучно обмежувати вплив української культури, монополізувати політичне, релігійне життя в регіоні. Ще у 2017 році навіть мій єдиний український храм Луганщини мав назву на честь російського святого князя Олександра Невського, прикладом якого раз по разу послуговувалися місцеві служителі Російської православної церкви для переконання тутешніх людей у нібито непереможності російського війська під його покровительством. Ну і, звісно, про успіхи в боротьбі з католицизмом та й таке інше. На той час військово-цивільні адміністрації вже розпочали очищення місцевої влади від сепаратистів. Інформаційний, культурний простір ставав все більше українським. Тож я, відчуваючи настрої моїх парафіян по духовному зціленню від руського міра, написав магістерську роботу, де дослідив доцільність канонізації Олександра Невського в Православній церкві України, а також і деяких інших успадкованих від Росії святих. Результатом цього стало здобуття права на перейменування храму. Нині він наречений на честь Воскресіння Христового. І місцеві мешканці з розумінням сприйняли нову назву. Водночас із цим я спостерігав за подіями навколо місцевої російськомовної школи, де вчителювала моя дружина. Адже на початку ми були дуже здивовані, бо ж адміністрація школи відкрито нав'язувала дітям святкування старих комуністичних свят, річниці комсомолу і змушували батьків писати заяви про ведення уроків російською мовою. Але згодом все змінилося. Школа стала україномовною, а я побачив, як місцеві мешканці радо доклали до цього зусиль. Військові, політичні, інформаційні події, що увірвалися в життя населення Сходу з початком агресії Росії, запустили механізм змін у національній свідомості українців. Зусилля центральної влади по перешкоджанню сепаратизму, ліквідація монопольного впливу місцевих олігархічних кланів на політичне життя, блокування проросійської пропаганди – все це створило умови для справжнього підйому національної свідомості мешканців Луганської області. Дуже повільний процес, але він безповоротний. З огляду реакції на війну і того жаху, що вразив тутешніх людей. Адже підрив Росією власного авторитету став найкращим стимулом для вивільнення українців Сходу з-під впливу руського міра. Але до сих пір залишається ще один рудимент від тих смертельних обіймів Росії. Це спотворена версія православ'я тут, від Російської православної церкви. З початком війни на сході України відкрився також і новий шлях до здорової конкуренції церков на Сході. Це шлях органічного розвитку, відновлення позиції тут Православної церкви України, інших церков, що підтримують українське суспільство. Надання Томосу про автокефалію у 2019 році ствердило незворотність цього процесу. Але відбувається він набагато повільнішими темпами, ніж цього очікує суспільство. Думаю, це з тієї причини, що релігійно українці є дуже стриманими. Ця стриманість продиктована колишнім тотальним пригніченням радянською державою релігійних свобод. Заразом із атеїстичною пропагандою українці засвоїли і байдужість до релігійного екстремізму. Зараз на Луганщині діє заледве до 10 священників Православної церкви України на противагу майже 600 служителям Російської Православної церкви УПЦ МП. Сучасна ідеологія руського міра цілеспрямовано декларує використання православної релігії і застосовується тут Російською Федерацією для утримання місцевого українського населення в орбіті впливу через релігійну свідомість. Дотепер тільки релігійний простір Сходу лишається під повним контролем Російської Федерації. Незрозумілою є бездіяльність Синоду Православної церкви України з цього питання. До сих пір ієрархи церкви аж ніяк не реагують на заклик відряджати з матеріальним забезпеченням на схід України ченців, молодих священників, випускників духовних навчальних закладів Києва, Івано-Франківська, Волині, Львова, які є у цих єпархіях із надзвичайно великим надлишком і просто не мають місця для свого постійного служіння. Адже визнання світовою спільнотою автокефалії Православної церкви України дозволило забезпечити тут населенню прифронтових областей вичерпну можливість сповідувати традиційне вселенське православ'я без штучно привнесених антиукраїнських перепон руського міра. Потрібна лише достатня кількість українських священників. Доля України сьогодні вирішується на Сході. Життєздатність Православної церкви України має бути стверджена її успіхами діяльності тут, в прифронтових областях. Тому я вважаю за доцільне рекомендувати вельмишановним представникам діаспори припиняти будь-яке донорське фінансування всіх проєктів Православної церкви України, які на 8-му році війни не мають за мету прямого вирішення ганебного становища прифронтових єпархій Сходу. Розбудова монастирів десь на Івано-Франківщині або лаври в Києві, в той час, як на призволяще покинутими лишаються мільйони українців Луганської і Донецької областей, я вважаю злочином. За час служіння в Луганській єпархії і в Збройних силах я усвідомив, існує штучно створений дискурс, наративи на релігійну тематику, що стоять на заваді соціальній згуртованості українців. Тому я вступив на PhD-програму до Києво-Могилянської академії з метою розробити систему протидії російській версії православ'я як одній із складових гібридної агресії Росії проти України. Поширення Росією наративів, фейків через підконтрольні інтернет-медіа, що замасковані під громадські організації, православні блоги, канали в Телеграмі, спільноти в Фейсбуці – все це є системною роботою добре підготовленого персоналу. Водночас паралельно діє потужна система сайтів, мережа ретрансляторів цих публікацій для аудиторії Греції, Сполучених Штатів Америки, Сербії, Чехії, Румунії, країн Балтії та інших держав із великою часткою православного населення. Моє дослідження дуже об'ємне, та вже на цьому етапі аналіз медіастратегії задіяних ворогом структур і професійність дій у кіберпросторі, їх миттєва реакція на події – все це свідчить не про інтереси окремо взятої релігійної організації Російської Православної Церкви, а про системний підхід інституції держави-агресора Російської Федерації в рамках цілей і завдань гібридної війни. Захист українського суспільства, що вразливе до дезінформації під прикриттям релігійного дискурсу, надважливе завдання у час війни. З огляду на високу ефективність ворожих дій у кіберпросторі, розробка теми по виявленню і протидії релігійної складової гібридної агресії вкрай потрібна. Задля впровадження ефективних заходів з такої протидії мені доводиться обробляти великі потоки інформації, систематизовувати, вдаватися подекуди до засобів осінт розвідки, семантичного аналізу, парсери специфічні розробляти, інше програмне забезпечення. Це все спонукає мене шукати підтримки, а також і досвіду фахівців із кібербезпеки, як в Україні, так і за її межами. Я констатую, що за 30 років незалежності України ніщо так якісно не вплинуло на нашу соціальну згуртованість і усвідомлення національної ідентичності, як війна з Росією. Ця загальнонаціональна загроза втратити власну державу. Одначе толерантність, історично властиву українцям, ми зберегли. Я вже казав вам про Айдар. Це міні-зріз активного українського суспільства з притаманними йому настроями, фобіями, відносинами між людьми, і тим точнішою зараз є моя оцінка та висновки про настрої українців у міжнаціональних і міжконфесійних відносинах. Черговий рубіж свідомості української нації перейдено, і перехід цей відбувся по лінії захисту від агресора, безвідносно до мови, національності чи релігії. Дай Боже.
Father Prosenko, thank you very much for your outline of the religious situation in Ukraine, particularly as in terms of the faith among the Ukrainian people, and in particular in the eastern part of Ukraine, and also for the outline of the threats that are posed by Russia against the current situation in Ukraine. So thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. Дуже вдячний за вашу презентацію. With that, we would like to move on to our next presenter, Ambassador Washchuk, Roman.
Thank you, Ambassador Popadyuk. Always good to sort of have a Roman to Roman transfer here. My assessments, and I'm going to try to briefly cover all four, will deviate both from the general outside consensus, but not from the iconoclastic Professor Motil, and even with some of my own takes from last year. So I hope this is the benefit of added distance, as opposed to, let's say, complete pandemic disconnect from realities on the ground. So when it comes to stable interethnic and class relations, actually what we're dealing with now in terms of Ukraine, the 93% of Ukraine, which administered out of Kyiv, is really more of inter-Ukrainian relations than classic inter-ethnic relations. Most polls taken over the last few years, because there hasn't been a census since 2001, show between 90 and 91% of people who self-identify as Ukrainian, of whom about 52% Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, 22.3% Russian-speaking Ukrainians, 13.6% bilingual switching between the two Ukrainians, and only 3.8% Russian-speaking Russians in Ukraine as it is now administered. So when people talk about the Russian issue, it is actually almost all about Ukrainians socio-linguistically absorbed into the Russian-speaking space over the course of both imperial and Soviet history, as opposed to Russians per se. Now, of course, there would be more if we were to include Crimea and the core Donbass, but they are currently excluded. There was a language law adopted in 2019. As in the case of the Tomos, rivers of blood were predicted both by Moscow and by credulous Western pundits. There have been no rivers of blood from the implementation of the language law, which has been largely implemented by the current authorities, despite the fact that it was adopted by the previous parliament and after the presidential election. A survey from last year indicates that people have seen report a 38% increase in the perceived use of Ukrainian. 52% said same level. And in fact, people who noticed the greatest increase in use of Ukrainian were people in the East. And the people least happy with implementation of the language law are people in the West, because they would have expected even more from it. But I think overall, you read a lot of people's reactions, mostly visceral, to a walk they took in the street, and depending on the language they heard, they're either despondent about the future of the country, or they're really inspired by a taxi driver they met on the drive from Boryspil Airport. depending on their linguistic orientation. But I think these stats show that the process of adopting the state language and turning it into a language of broader social connection is proceeding. Attempts to use the language issue as a wedge issue haven't really worked. They haven't worked so well for the pro-Russian parties, who are now deprived of a platform as well, but they can also backfire on the patriotic segment of the spectrum. And you can see European solidarity trying to use very hardcore interpretations of the language issue to generate enthusiasm, but it's also led, for example, to the detonation of the Holus Party over what is actually, frankly, a fairly minor language-related broadcasting law change. The pandemic has been a common challenge for Ukrainians across regions. So you have the attitudes, largely negative, but still, which are very similar across regions and language groups. Attitudes to how has the president handled it? Ratings have been going down. How has the government handled it? A Ukrainian government is never popular. And the Ministry of Health, also not good. But this hasn't really been a social contract deal breaker because Ukrainians, frankly, didn't expect any better of a government. And so they aren't crushed to discover that it hasn't delivered. Ukraine was a hotbed of vaccine skepticism as well as a hotbed of COVID, but that skepticism is now dipping below 50%. It's still far too high, but still going in the right direction because even limited vaccinations are having a demonstration effect. People have been vaccinated, they're still walking around, they're not magnetic, they're not dead, as well as people getting the news from other countries where a lot of Ukrainians now work, and the arrival of Western manufactured shots. And that's a thank you to COVAX funders like the EU, the US, and Canada for helping to make that happen. So you have even the not very well handled pandemic situation not being a national unity or cohesion detonator. Interfaith relations, interestingly, Ukraine at this point is more religiously than ethnically diverse. It is, in fact, one of the most religiously diverse countries in its region. It has the All Ukrainian Council of Churches, which has been working harmoniously, and it includes every significant and even relatively minor religious group in the country. This year, under the chair of Patriarch Sviatoslav of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, who is someone who's very conscious of the role of religious organizations in broader social policy. So they've been devoting more attention to social issues such as rights of the unjustly imprisoned, prevention of domestic violence, and to environmental concerns. But they're also united in opposing the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, which foresees a gender-based approach to domestic violence. So there they are at odds with women's rights advocates. The previous speaker mentioned transitions from the Moscow Patriarchate to the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. They stopped being a mass phenomenon after Poroshenko left office, but they're slowly starting up again this spring. And I think the issue of the Moscow Patriarchate, its role will be coming up again and become a bit of a challenge because of President Zelensky's invitation to the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew to come for Ukraine's 30th anniversary of independence celebrations in August. So what you've seen there is an evolution where President Zelensky was seen as the guy who allows the Moscow Patriarchate to survive by winning against Tomos man, President Poroshenko. But now, as his position has become one of asserting the state, he is the one who's working to invite the Ecumenical Patriarch to Ukraine. Sense of common history. I think in listening to yesterday's presentation by Rada speaker Dmytro Razumkov, you can see that there's been a convergence in the narratives on recent 21st century history. His retelling of the stories of the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan, as Revolution of Dignity did not differ much from what we would have heard from his predecessor, Andriy Poruby. The notable difference being that Mr. Poruby was a direct participant and Mr. Razumkov was not. In fact, he had been the head of the Young Regions organization, but you can see the evolution of a common narrative happening there. Now, that is sort of the last 20 years. There's continuing dissension over the World War II period. The Babin Yar being the most notable project and irritant in this respect, and the suspicion that this private sector-led consortium is too heavily influenced by Russian money and creatives. That's just one of the controversial issues on the plate of the new director of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, Anton Drobovich. I think he's actually doing a pretty good job of broadening the scope of the Institute's work beyond the World War II era and looking at a range of Ukrainian patriotic narratives beyond those simply of the organized nationalist movement. That's also helped in attenuating the history-based controversies Ukraine was having with neighboring countries, especially Poland. You've seen the end, really kind of a dying down of the history war over the Volyn massacres and other elements of wartime history. That's allowed Ukraine to resume high-level strategic contacts on current issues, Nord Stream 2, EU, NATO, with the current Polish government. Sense of a common future. Again, an interesting December 2020 poll question. Would you want to return to Ukraine as it was prior to 2014? Question was asked in June of 2018 and then in December of 2020. So 2018, I was still in Ukraine, considered to be a kind of high point of things moving in what many certainly diaspora saw as the right direction. And then December 2020, midpoint of the Zelensky presidency and in the midst of a pandemic. What's happened? Nostalgia ain't what it used to be. There's been a 6% shift over those 2 years towards the answer to would you want to go back being no. So 54% of respondents said no, we don't want to go back to pre-2014 Ukraine. 36% still would. Now, that may partly be literally generational shift, but I think it's also the product of evolving attitudes. Finally, if we look at the World Values Survey taken in July, August of 2020, again, elements of the pandemic lockdown were still in place. So it was done virtually and by tablet. So in comparison with 2011, which was the previous big survey period, Ukrainians are more proud of their country, 82% versus 67%. And interestingly, and this is something that Ms. Matvichuk mentioned, a higher degree of mutual social trust, 30% versus 23%. Now you might say that's still a bit pathetic, but still that's an increase of a third over what's been a very tumultuous period. And I think the Maidan experience supporting the army has contributed to that. This 30% level of mutual social trust, and again, this is among people. Do you trust other people? Not do you trust governments or do you trust institutions? Actually puts Ukraine in the top half of Europeans, just barely. And so I think I may need to throw out some of my rusty low trust talking points after this. However, trust in institutions is down. And so the irony is that after 5-6 years of internationally motivated institution building, ordinary people trust each other more, but trust the institutions we were trying to so hard to reinforce less. So there's a question to be addressed there. And in fact, ironically, in light of, again, the focus of many conference discussions, not just this one, but mostly others, The anti-corruption institutions are trusted almost least of any in Ukraine. The national police is trusted 3 times more than the anti-corruption institutions. So there are important conundrums to look at here in trying to figure out what's going on. Ukrainians are also just plain happier than they used to be, apparently, at a personal family level, 78% as opposed to 68% in 2011. But they're in the lower third of Europeans in terms of happiness. What's also been a big shift is the belief in self-reliance for success. You got to work for it, you got to depend on yourself, has doubled since 2011. So it went from around 25% to 50%. And again, these are broad societal attitudes as opposed to focus groups of individual people. And also commitment to the broad idea of democracy, actually very high. It's around 95.2%. Now, that doesn't mean it translates into practice or the kind of activism that people would like to see, but it's there. You could say, you know, how accurate is this survey? It's taken only once every 7 years, but it's not really an outlier. Kyiv International Institute of Sociology in April of this year, 2021, on a well-being scale of -100 to +100, Ukrainians put their personal well-being at +15, and the nation as a whole at -32. Now, that may not look like much, but these are actually the highest readings since polling started on this subject in 2012. So maybe my departure from Ukraine helped. People are feeling better. Who's feeling happiest? Young people and Westerners. Now, this partly intersects with the phenomenon that that was being identified. Westerners, I mean Western Ukrainians, with what Professor Motel was talking about. Possibly it's because these are the most mobile people in Ukraine. Because really the biggest mass movement in Ukraine is not a political party. It's not even an NGO. It's Ukrainians going to work abroad. Which also means that they come back with new resources and ideas. These are organic societal developments. There's no direct ultimate outcome relationship to any of the international community's projects or initiatives. But what they do show is that Ukrainian society, not civil society, but just plain society, has a life of its own. It's independent of government policies or governance crises. There's a vector of development. Maybe Ukraine at this point is a kind of Slavic Italy, making progress despite governance almost constantly being perceived as in crisis. Where Zelensky and his administration and party have been possibly inadvertent facilitators of this is in their role as people who are intuitively pursuing the mushy center of Ukraine, both geographically and politically and societally. You know, they're incoherent, they're wobbly, they're contradictory, but in that they're much like many ordinary Ukrainians, as opposed to articulate, focused, singular, multi-issue advocates that mostly appear at conferences. It means in Ukraine, you've got a sort of centrist populism. That also, I guess, saps support from right-wing populism and left-wing extremism. And it also explains why support for Zelensky is cratered less than for previous Ukrainian presidents. Not huge, but still greater than any of his predecessors at this point in their term. So I am overall quite positive in my marks for Ukrainian society overall, not government or institutions or even NGOs, but for society overall.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for that excellent presentation analysis of polling data. Roman, I think you rightly point out and make clear for our audience the growing strength of social cohesion in Ukraine in terms of individual rights, adherence to democracy, although there's a distrust of institutions, but overall it's a positive movement forward. I think we have time for a few questions, Walter, and I'd like to take the prerogative of being the moderator of this panel to pose the first question. And I'd actually like to pick up on what Roman just was talking about, the progress of social cohesion, as I would call it, in Ukraine. All of our panelists presented a fairly positive development in terms of the development of Ukrainian society, civic society growing. Professor Motter spoke about the growing interaction of East and West. And we just heard what Roman mentioned about individual views of Ukrainians. And of course, Father Prosenko spoke about religion. My question, and I think the question will probably go, I'd hate to put you on the spot, Professor, but I'd like to address it to you because you've done so much analysis of Ukraine at this stage, but the question is to everyone. If we take this, as I see, a fairly positive assessment, although there are certain flaws, obviously, in the development of society in Ukraine, as in any society, if we take this fairly positive assessment and we look at the outside world's narrative of Ukraine, that Ukraine is a divided country, pro-Russian, and ready to fall apart along ethnic lines. And I base that question on things from over 30 years ago. If you go back to the December 1991 referendum for independence in Ukraine, about 91% of the Ukrainian people voted for independence, including the majority of ethnic Russians, including the majority of ethnic Russians in Crimea, which is ethnically a Russian majority-based population in Crimea. They all expected an independent Ukraine to be more prosperous and therefore present a better future for themselves and their children. Given that context, what explains this narrative that we always hear about, that Ukraine is a sphere of Russia, that Ukraine is pro-Russian, that Ukraine is always at loggerheads with itself ethnically? So, Professor, if you'd be kind enough maybe to address this question and start the others to think about it.
Well, I think there are several reasons. I mean, one, of course, is that there is this competing Russian or Russocentric narrative that exists, and is propagated by Russian propaganda, but also by social media and people like that. But that aside, I think there's a more fundamental problem, and that is that until 1991, Ukraine didn't exist in the popular consciousness anywhere in the world. And it's only in the last 10 years that Ukraine has really become something in the nature of a player on mental maps. Now, that's a mixed metaphor, but the point is, even until the Orange Revolution, people didn't really know what Ukraine was, didn't really know why it mattered, who cared, and so on. And those attitudes still exist. So that's problem number one. Ignorance takes time to overcome, and it's not easy. The second problem is that given this context of ignorance and given ready-made narratives produced by Russian or pro-Russian propaganda, it's very easy for journalists and analysts to fall into simplistic modes of thinking. We do that all the time. I mean, if we were to ask ourselves, I mean, how do we view Africa? I suspect most of us would say, well, it's just a hellhole. All right. Well, of course, that's not true. Parts of it are, parts of it are not. How do we view other parts of the world? Again, we tend to view it in relatively simplistic terms based on our ignorance, based on the ignorance underlying journalistic accounts, and based on the need by journalists to formulate relatively simplistic stories, simplistic analysis that are readily understandable and that have a punch. If you look at the scholarly literature on Ukraine, which of course has mushroomed over the last 20, 30 years, it's relatively sophisticated. It tends to be nuanced. I mean, there are obviously exceptions, but whether it's in English or whether it's in Ukrainian, it's relatively sophisticated. But people don't read that. Journalists don't read that. Analysts may read that, but again, their views happen to be limited as well in terms of effectiveness and influence. So I tend to see this as a problem that has to do with Ukraine's having been a non-entity that is becoming an entity. Arguably by now, it's become a fixture of these mental maps. And I would expect the sophistication to increase progressively over time. That said, I also expect these simplistic interpretations to continue to exist. It's just in the nature of modern journalism, especially in the nature of social media-driven modern journalism, for simple-minded approaches to be dominant and to play a very important role. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I seem to have lost my video. Okay. Walter, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, sir.
Okay. Seems to have lost my video, but does anyone else want to add anything?
Yes, if I might. Bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I think the other source of this image are Ukrainian avant-garde ultra-reformers who will go either domestically or go abroad and say, if our country has not reached every brilliant possible level of human development, we are abject failures And what we really need to talk about collectively is our being corruption champions. You will recall the last big online conference to happen, which was a couple of weeks ago. The Democracy in Action part of the descriptor was fantastic, but it all going under zero corruption just adds to the association of Ukraine as no hoper internationally. I think Ukraine needs more Oleksandr Matviichuks, who today gave us a balanced view of what is an evolving situation instead of enumerating every one of the human rights failures which Ukraine as a transitional country of 40 million inevitably has. And so I think there needs to be a greater awareness within Ukraine of how you speak honestly, but with a sense of perspective about their country to outsiders as well.
Okay. Think anyone else want to add any comments?
Yes, Pani Alexandra has her hand up.
Okay,
So,
Thank you very much. I would like to add three brief points. The first is that the battle is going on symbolical level, and we have a war of different narratives. Putin, even before the war, when he conducted with occupation of Crimea and hybrid war in the Donbass, told that Ukraine is not a state. So this is the Putin's narratives, and we as Ukrainians has provide another narratives on this symbolical battle. A second point that in order to be successful, it's very good to be inspiring by alternative. And for years, we have not such alternative of democratical role model, because before visa liberalization, if I'm not mistaken, 70% of Ukrainians has not foreign passports, and they couldn't travel abroad and see how works society where the police is not beaten peaceful student demonstration, the court is independent, and the government is not so corrupt and work for their own people. And now we have such opportunity after a visa liberalization regime. And for 7 years, the level of people who traveled abroad and see this preferable of democratical role model is extremely increasing. And it also provides us an energy in this battle on symbolical level. But what is much more important in this regard, that I work not only in Ukraine, I have a lot of colleagues, human rights defenders in Russia, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, in Poland. And I saw that a lot of problem inside country is because we have a lack of citizens. What do I mean when I say lack of citizens? I mean a lack of people who see their responsibility like citizens of this country, that they have an influence to the public affair, and they have to do this influence and to use any opportunity of civil oversight, of civil participation and other mechanisms in order to provide their energy in the general transformation. And I think that, as I told, and once again emphasize on this point, that involving ordinary people in the process of change, not work in the close civil society circle, is now the new task for Ukraine.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists for their presentations and also for addressing this question. Walter, I don't see any other questions unless I missed them because I got offline there for a second visually. Are there any? Do we have?
Yes, there is.
We do have Father Paula wanted to respond to that as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
And then we do have to get to the grades as well.
Okay.
So yes, there is Father Paula, and there is one question. But yes, we probably do have to get to the grades. The question, I would just read it, is how can Ukraine continue to move the needle of de-Russification through society in order to combat hybrid warfare?
Okay.
And that might be what Otech can answer. Actually.
Okay.
Yes. Proszę.
Шановне панство, за надане слово.
Так, коротко, так.
В прикладі, який зараз традиційно вважається найкращим, адже літочислення ведемо ми від Різдва Христового, живемо в час нової ери і таке інше. В прикладі, який вважається на цей час найкращим, нам показано, згадаймо, коли Ісус Христос пішов на свою місію. Як виповнилось 30. Це символічне значення, дозвіл за тисячолітній, десятитисячнолітній досвід людства, дозвіл до повноліття, дозвіл до користування всіма благами, набутими населенням, дозвіл промовляти до людей, дозвіл виконати своє призначення, місію. Цього року ми очікуємо повноліття України. І цього року ми очікуємо врешті те покоління, про яке так багато сказано, що воно потихеньку, звісно, але візьме Україну в свої руки. Це 30-літні хлопці і жінки, дівчата, яких я побачив на війні левову частку зі Сходу, які раніше і гадки не мали, що Україна їх батьківщина. Про Революцію Гідності осторонь чули по телебаченню і радіо, але пройшовши крізь горнило війни, ці чоловіки і жінки чітко засвоїли, що ось вона Україна, ось вона їх земля, ось він їхній народ. Вони це кров'ю ствердили своєю, своїх рідних, друзів, наречених і так далі. Тому що я на Сході від початку, як такого з'явлення капеланства, всі бойові підрозділи, якими опікувався, це представники населення Сходу, Луганської і Донецької областей. За рідкісними виключеннями. 90% населення. Тому процес України, коли прибрана перепона, як процес того паростка найбільшого дерева, він проростає органічно. Лише приберіть старі перепони, нав'язані ідеологією імперською, спершу імперіалістичною Російської імперії, зрештою шовіністичним продовженням Радянської імперії, а наразі оці мізерні намагання новітньої псевдоімперії, невдалої, неуспішної Російської Федерації. Приберіть їх, і народ України проросте на власній землі, розквітне і дасть плоди свої. Свобода. Революцію Гідності продовжила війна за свободу. Це у нас і в гербі стверджено, в дусі нашого населення, скрізь. Це те, що об'єднує нас за напрямком духу з американським народом. Нація свободи. Дай Боже.
Thank you very much, Father. I think you rightly point out that the war with Russia has awakened in the new generation a sense of being Ukrainian and support for the homeland, so to speak. So, Walter, I understood the question, but I think the question that you posed about the Russian role was kind of answered by all four panelists in some way or another. So, if it's okay with you, maybe we can move on to the grading system now.
Так. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have a particular question, or do you want us to address, or do you want me just to poll the panelists in terms of this, giving a grade on the social cohesion level of Ukraine? Oh, there we go. Here. Okay. Let me read the questions. Viable social cohesion and established national identity. Okay, assessing Ukraine's progress and regress. Issues to consider: stable inter-ethnic and class relations, stable interfaith relations, a sense of a common history, a sense of a common future. Now, we can do this in one of two ways, Walter. I guess we can give a grade to each four of those subcategories, or we could give one overall grade to the whole issue. And what I'll do is I'll just poll the panelists along the lines that they had made their presentation. So Ms. Matvichuk, if you would be kind enough to give us your assessment. And do it either way you want. You could grade each of the 4 subsets or just the overall issue.
For the end, I can only said that yes, Ukraine faced with a lot of challenges, but I look into a future with optimism. I don't see our future easy, but I'm sure that we will fulfill our role, which we have to do, and we will succeed. Thank you.
Okay. What grade would you give them?
Would you give them a higher grade or a lower grade? Я би було українські п'ятірка або четвірка. Яку оцінку ви б дали? What grade would you give?
For social cohesion, sorry, I don't understand the question. The problem is that I read the report which was done about social cohesion of USAID was made a huge report, and I know that there are different point of problems which in this report are raised. That's why I think that it's I wouldn't like to simplify and to provide a concrete mark.
All right.
That's fair enough.
Provide a concrete action to face to solve.
Do you think? I'll ask that one question of has Ukraine simply the big question would then just be one, and that is, do you think in the last year Ukraine has improved in its social cohesion or regressed in social cohesion?
I'm totally sure that we are on the right direction, and from year to year we move on the for the good goal. But as I told, the active organized minority as define the vector, and passive majority define the speed of our moving. That's why we need to involve a lot of people and to make organized minority much bigger.
Okay,
that's fine. That's fine. We could. I understand, Walter. Let's move on to Professor Motyl then.
A common history, I'd give Ukraine a B-. Common future, an A-.
Oh. That's very nice.
Okay. But that's Prosenko.
Дякую. Якщо немає більшої за ту любов, яку сказано б, проявила людина, поклавши душу свою, все життя своє, аж до смерті, за ближніх, за тих, кого любить він чи вона, якщо немає більшої за ту любов, то і немає більшої за ту оцінку цієї любові, ніж А з плюсом, заради чого і кладуть свої життя і присвячують українці не тільки на Сході, по всьому світові, весь цей час. І тому наразі ця оцінка – це А з плюсом. Це та оцінка тієї найвищої любові в її найвищому прояві. Дякую, дай Боже.
Дуже добре, дякую. Ambassador Washchuk.
I'm A-, B+ across the board.
Across the board?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, some closer to A- and history closer to B+.
Okay. Walter, that's all 4 panelists. I guess you want my assessment then.
Yes.
I would say an A- across the board. I think Ukraine has done substantial progress over the last 30 years in all its categories. And I feel very confident about the future. As I think all of our panelists indicated, that Ukraine is moving in the right direction and building a cohesion along the lines that we in the West understand.
Even though rhetorically Ukrainians might sometimes be united in all saying they're at the edge of the abyss, but they all say it together.
Yeah.
In some ways, this kumbaya moment It really wraps up a wonderful panel, absolutely beautiful beautifully packaged panel. And it's as a result of the wonderful diplomats that we've had, both Romans. And bravo to all the panelists. That's Pani Alexander, absolutely marvelous to opening. Otec Pavlo, and my good friend, Professor Alexander Motor. There's a reason why you're ranked one of the top poli-sci professors in America. So you can't get much better than the panel you've just run. So thank you again for all of that.
Thank you very much. Walter, thanks again for organizing this, and thank you to all the panelists again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
And with that, actually with Ambassador Livestream, who's been there as part of the World Congress, I think we're going to be hearing from the head of the Ukrainian global diaspora in the next section. And this is a very nice add-in. So what I would do now is I would actually turn to what has become merged into one process. That is the final session to be run by UKK's National Office Director, Pani Tamara Yalo, and she will be having her own word. Then she will also fuse in with, we were hoping to have Senator Portman, but Senator Portman did gracefully give us a video, could not make it live on the webinar, but gave us a video, and he will be followed after Pani Tamara's word and after the senator's word. They will be followed by our good friend from the north, but he's also the president, literally, of the Global Armada, Pavlo Grod. I'm asking all of them to join us now. And at the end, I think our tally master and our brilliant and marvelous webmaster or webinar master, Andrei Dobryansky, to give us the lowdown on all the grades, both from the audience, from the experts and the audience. So with that, Tamara, sorry I took so much time. Go ahead, Tamara, it's all yours now.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth and final focus session, How the United States Can Best Help Ukraine Attain Its Euro-Atlantic Vision. And thank you, Walter, for giving me this opportunity to moderate this panel. As a moderator, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and provide a few comments of my own and maybe turn the tables just a little bit on the topic at hand. I think the timing of this conference is extremely fitting, and I think most everybody has mentioned that throughout the past 2 days. Just yesterday, Biden held a summit with Vladimir Putin. That meeting was on the heels of the G7 gathering and the US-EU summit and Monday's meeting with the heads of state and government of the 30 NATO allies. It was during this summit that the alliance reiterated their decision made still back 13 years ago. And Ambassador Volker earlier today actually underscored that it's actually the same language that they used back in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, where they said Ukraine will become a member of the alliance with the membership action plan as the integral part of the process, and it will be judged on its own merits. While there's no membership checklist for NATO accession, NATO has made it clear that there are certain criteria outside of military that a nation must possess. And they're the obvious ones I think everybody understands. That's having democratic values, including tolerance and diversity, having a market economy, having a firm civilian control over their military, obviously being a good neighbor and respecting the sovereignty of other nations, and then working towards interoperability with NATO forces. The Monday's communique also in NATO declared that Russia is a big threat. I don't think they've ever done that before, at least I don't recall. But even with this acknowledgement, there needs to be a political will on the part of the United States and our European allies towards not only Ukraine's territorial integrity and its sovereignty, but also its potential future in the inclusion of the world's greatest alliance. So after listening to the various panelists and experts of the last 2 days debate and discuss Ukraine's progress or regress in the various categories, many of which coincidentally overlap with NATO's desired criteria for potential membership, maybe the question needs to be placed, is the West committed to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic future? Will NATO provide Ukraine with a membership action plan, or at least a pathway towards MAP? Our first speaker listed this afternoon, as Walter has mentioned on the program, hails from the great state of Ohio, but unfortunately was unable to be with us this afternoon. He is a stalwart supporter of Ukraine, and he did send a brief video with his remarks. But before we share the video, I'd like to properly introduce Senator Rob Portman. With this group, he probably doesn't need an introduction, but I do think he deserves one. The senator has continuously stood up for Ukraine. He's also led the efforts in Senate to provide Ukraine with the type of assistance that Ukraine needs to ward off Russian aggression, as well as to help maintain its territorial integrity. Over the past several years, Senator Portman introduced amendments to the annual National Defense Authorization Act that expands US support for Ukraine. He most recently in March also co-sponsored the Ukraine Security Partnership Act, which would provide Ukraine security assistance and strategic support. But in addition to his military support, he puts his words where his mouth is. He co-founded and he continues to co-chair the Senate Ukraine Caucus. And he's traveled to Ukraine multiple times, if I'm not mistaken, either 4 or 5 in the last few years. The most recent trip was in May, at the end of May, actually, with his Democratic colleagues in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senators Shaheen and Murphy. And they traveled to Ukraine as well as Georgia to convey the solidarity of the American people with Ukraine and also to affirm our US commitment to our strategic partner. So Andriy, can I ask you to please play the senator's video?
Yep, it's getting queued up right now.
Thank you.
Almost there. Sorry, it's just not showing on me. Here it is. Why can't I see it? My apologies. It's just my screen froze. I'm going to close him and restart him. There we go.
Everybody has some technical issues sometimes.
Hi, I'm US Senator. Great. Okay. There he is. And we are sharing. I guess that's what we're sharing with sound. Share. Okay. And I need this. Are we seeing it?
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. It's great to be joining you all at the Center for US-Ukrainian Relations from here in Washington, D.C. I wish we could be together in person, but know that I am with you in spirit. I'm pleased to be able to give you a quick update on what the United States needs to do to support our important ally in Kyiv as it continues down the path of economic reform. What I saw in Eastern Europe during my recent trip to the region should be a cause of concern for all of us as Americans. There is a clear, renewed Russian effort to destabilize Ukraine and other young democracies in the region in an attempt to legitimize their authoritarian power grabs in the region. Ukraine is increasingly facing Russian military threats near their eastern border. It's also a key target for Russian cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns to try to destabilize the Ukrainian democracy. Russia continues to occupy and militarize Crimea, of course, after illegally annexing it 7 years ago. And with the Biden administration's recent reversal of policy, unfortunately, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project that helps Russia and hurts Ukraine looks like it may go ahead as planned. During my trip, I was able to sit down with President Zelensky once again. It was a great opportunity for us to talk about the importance of strengthening democracy and rooting out corruption. We also discussed Ukraine's goal of becoming a member of NATO, something I strongly support and something I urge the Biden administration to support as well. Our support would send a strong signal that America and Europe are serious about standing up for our friends in the region who have turned to us. Just today in Switzerland, President Biden is sitting down for his first face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin. I encourage him to take this opportunity to take a strong, decisive stance for freedom, democracy, human rights in Eastern Europe, and particularly to raise the issue of Ukraine. The free world is watching. Moving ahead, I'll continue to lead efforts in Congress to support Ukraine by continuing to serve as the co-chair of the bipartisan Senate Ukraine Caucus. Through our work, we have ensured that the Senate, with bipartisan support, has provided more robust security assistance every year to Ukraine since 2014. This aid has proved invaluable to the troops at the line of contact in the Donbass. Last year, we secured $250 million in assistance, including a record $75 million for missiles and weapons. I will also keep pushing for the funding we need to effectively combat the disinformation war Ukraine is fighting with Russia. The State Department Global Engagement Center is the focal point for our interagency efforts to combat disinformation abroad. Time and time again, it's proven itself in helping our allies to push back against Russian disinformation. I'm pleased to see we recently authorized an additional $150 million for this critical initiative. In the United States Senate passed bipartisan U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. GEC is my legislation along with Senator Chris Murphy, and it's incredibly important. These funds will play a key role in our fight to protect Ukraine's democracy. But above all, I will continue to bring attention to this ongoing campaign by Russia to suppress the fledgling democracies in the region. Ukraine joins other young democracies, such as Georgia, who have shed the chains of their Soviet past and agreed to join the United States and Europe as free, independent nations who chart their own future. Their very existence as democracies are a threat to Russia, and this is why we must continue to support and reinforce their efforts. Thank you all for all the work you do every day to advance the critical ties between the United States and Ukraine. With your help, I believe our two great countries are on the path to a strong and enduring friendship.
As you can see from the Senator's remarks, Ukraine and the Ukrainian American community is extremely lucky to have such a friend and steadfast supporter in the U.S. Senate. He really goes above and beyond what most friends of Ukraine do. Walter, I believe, yes, I do see Paul Grod on the line. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing a valued colleague of mine who has dedicated much of his life to Ukrainian causes. Even though professionally he's an attorney and business leader, where he serves as president and CEO of Rodan Energy Solutions, which is a leading North American energy management company. In his spare time, if he actually has spare time, he is the president of the Ukrainian World Congress, an international coordinating body of the 20 million strong diaspora that reside in 65 countries. It's an extremely difficult position to be the president of this coordinating body. Prior to being elected in 2018, he also served as vice president of the organization for 10 years, as well as president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Pavlo, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamara. Very much appreciate being here, and especially on a victorious day for Ukraine, who won 2-1 in the Euro Cup playoff against Macedonia, or North Macedonia rather. So at least there's something we can cheer for today. But thank you for this opportunity. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the beginnings of democratization in the former Soviet and Warsaw Pact countries, we said farewell to the Cold War and a new era of peace and prosperity. However, 30 years later, we find ourselves in a world faced by multifaceted threats and systemic competition from assertive and authoritarian powers. This was stated in the communique of the recent NATO summit in Brussels. This document also directly names Russia as one of these authoritarian powers, which, quote, constitutes a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Unfortunately for the West, in the shadow of fragile Russian democratic institutions rose a new imminent threat, an aggressive and reactionary regime of Vladimir Putin, who considers the fall of the USSR as the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century and dreams of revising the existing, revising the existing liberal international order and of restoring Russia's global dominance. For years, Russia has waged wars of aggression against Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and other neighbors. Putin's regime uses hybrid warfare, disinformation, assassinations, cyber attacks, and other global provocations to destabilize and divide the West and to undermine the values of democracy and the rules-based international order. Ukraine has been on the forefront of countering this Russian aggression, defending its territorial integrity and sovereignty for the past 7 years. And since 2014, when Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, illegally annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, and occupied parts of the Donbas region, causing at least 14,000 deaths. However, it's critical to understand that Ukraine today is defending not only itself, but the West as a whole and Western values. Ukraine is at the front line of the new Cold War. For over 15 years, in successive rounds of free and fair internationally recognized elections, which many of us have been involved with as international observers, Ukrainians have chosen a pro-Western path of development and Euro-Atlantic integration. By its military and hybrid aggression, Russia continues to interfere in Ukraine's domestic processes and reverse the democratic choice the Ukrainian people have taken through brute force. A collapse of Ukrainian statehood is what Vladimir Putin dreams about. The Euro-Atlantic Alliance must stand together and be strong to protect the rules-based international order and the values of democracy from the authoritarian Russia and its allies. The United States has to once again realize themselves as the leader of the free world. The Euro-Atlantic community should support the democratic, pro-Western choice of the Ukrainian nation, not only with words, but by enhancing security in the region and accelerating Ukraine's NATO integration and membership. We often speak about reforms in Ukraine, and we agree that the primary focus should be on comprehensive judicial reform and on strengthening the rule of law and building strong democratic institutions, which are the only guarantee for the successful development of Ukraine's economy, welfare, and foreign investment. But let's not use that as an excuse not to support Ukraine. Ukraine has made significant progress in reforming key institutions, such as a Central Election Committee, the Central Bank, Naftahaz, among others. Yes, they have a long way to go, but they need support rather than a cold shoulder for not doing enough or making the occasional misstep. The Ukrainian World Congress and Ukrainian communities around the world, particularly the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, are playing a vitally important role in supporting the people of Ukraine and promoting their Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Considering the existing global conditions, we have to significantly step up efforts to strengthen the global Ukrainian voice. Ukrainian communities around the world must use their unique knowledge and understanding of Ukraine to help both Ukraine and the international community avoid the so-called perception gap. Just recently, we were having conversations with senior Ukrainian government officials, and they see the whole world and what is happening in Ukraine and their reform agenda quite differently than the rest of the world has been stating publicly. So that is a perception gap that we certainly need to address. Finally, we're looking forward to President Zelensky's visit to the United States in late July and his talks with President Biden and officials in Washington. And of course, we know that the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America will take the lead in supporting this extremely important visit. Friends, thank you for organizing this important conference of global thought leaders and for providing me this opportunity, and for all your efforts to help bring long-lasting peace and security to Ukraine and the region. Thank you very much. Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. Thank you, Pavla, for your insightful and overarching remarks and for the work that the Ukrainian World Congress does under your leadership.
Thank you.
It's in the 8th year of Russia's ongoing hybrid war, the deliberate national and human rights violations that continue to threaten Ukraine's ongoing transformation into a modern European democracy, which respects the rule of law and honors its history. However, despite these odds, Has Ukraine initiated and implemented the reforms across the various sectors addressed in our forum today and yesterday? Has Ukraine met the criteria for membership, potential membership, in the strongest and greatest alliance in history? Over the past 2 days, our discussants presented their grades. What have our panelists ascertained? I now have the pleasure of introducing our conference's tally master. And I must say, I'm thankful that Walter relieved me of this duty this year because our experts were pretty hard graders. Many of you know Andriy Dobryansky as a technical guru behind our forums, but Andriy is much more than that. He serves as the Director of Communications and Media for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and chairs the UN Committee for the Ukrainian World Congress. Andriy, the floor is yours.
And I'm here as I'm making sure our message is out on social media. Here we go. Yes. So if everybody has the program book, I will run down who is speaking just as a reminder. But we had 4 plenary sessions. Some of you may have heard, as Tamara said, some harsh grades, but those were really segmented onto individual issues. For instance, we had our plenary session, the first plenary session yesterday morning. That was about robust democratic politics, assessing Ukraine's progress and regress. We did hear some harsh grades when it came to specific topics of consideration, specifically the independent judiciary. I believe at least one of our panelists, Ostap Krivda, gave Ukraine's judiciary an F. However, if you look at the overall grades from Stephen Nix of the International Republican Institute, from Katie Fox, National Democratic Institute, as well as Adrian Karatnitsky from the Atlantic Council, overall, we have a C, an overall grade of C from Mr. Nix, an overall grade of C- from Ostap. Adrian gave a B-. Miss Fox she very cogently said that it wouldn't be her place to judge a foreign country. However, our moderator, Ambassador William Taylor, he said, well, I'll judge the United States as well as Ukraine, and he gave both countries a B for robust democratic politics, giving a sense that both countries have something to aspire to. So do you have those overall grades now, Vlodku, right? Everybody heard those. Okay.
Yes.
I'll move on to the plenary session 2. That was about developed market economics and energy security. That was helmed by Ambassador John Herbst. Anders Osland participated. Morgan Williams participated. Ariel Cohen participated, as well as Margarita Asenova. We also had a special guest speaker. That would be Natalie Yaresko, the former Minister of Finance from Ukraine. So that was very great of Walter to be able to coordinate all this so that we can have that perspective in talking about market economics. However, due to the enormous amount of interest in Ukraine and that whole region of the world at the same time as a press conference by either President Putin or President Biden, we had a number of interruptions, I believe, of Mr. Aslan. So there's a couple of people who had to drop out, one of them being Mr. Morgan Williams. So he did not give us a final grade. Neither did Anders. However, that still leaves 3 people with solid grades as well as the moderator. So towards the overall grade, Mr. Ariel Cohen gave a C+. As with other people, he did comment on the issue of improving energy transportation. He gave that a lower grade, but he did give an overall grade of C+ for market economics in Ukraine. Margarita Asenova slightly higher, a B-. Natalie Yaresko, a C+ as well. And John Herbst, the moderator, Mr. Ambassador, he gave the entire session a C as well. Moving on to today's 2 plenary sessions. Here we go into general greater security of Ukraine, assessing Ukraine's progress and regress. As you may remember from just a couple of hours ago, that was Ambassador William Courtney. He did give us an overall grade of I believe a B-. Ambassador Kurt Volker, he gave us, I'm just averaging the grades now because they're recent. I see a B+, C-. It seems like a B overall. Although his harshest of grades for that was reserved for the modernization of the industrial complex in Ukraine. Glenn Howard wanted to make sure that we knew that the Navy deserves an F. However, his overall grade was a C minus. As we all know, Mr. Howard from the Jamestown Foundation is very knowledgeable. Yeah, tough grader, but also has visited Ukraine and
so many times.
Has advocated very strongly for a stronger Ukrainian Navy. But overall, a C minus on that count. James Scher gave a B plus overall, but if you're asking him a question which we did not ask him, which is does Ukraine understand as a whole understand the fundamentals of security? He says not quite yet. D minus, close to F in terms of an integrated defense system, but. As far as the questions we presented to him, what are Ukraine's professionalized armed forces status, the development of a national security doctrine, the reliability of its allies, he gave it a B plus. So that's quite good from James, who is also a harsh grader. And finally, we have Alexander Gray from the American Foreign Policy Council. He gave an overall grade of B minus. With lots of room for improvement as well. And I think overall, the major topic where they would like to see something better for Ukraine is reliable allies, but that's not necessarily on Ukraine's end. It's how reliable the allies can be for Ukraine. Lastly, we had plenary session number 4, which is viable social cohesion and an established national identity. That was chaired by Ambassador Roman Popadyuk. He gave, based on the topics of consideration, which are stable interethnic and class relations, stable interfaith relations, a sense of common history, and a sense of common future, he gave the entire grade there an A minus. Which is also close to Alexander Motyl, another professor who is known to be a harsh grader, but he gave Ukraine's progress and regress in terms of social cohesion a B minus or B plus or an A minus, with a positive outlook on the future of Ukraine. Ambassador Vashchuk also an A minus B plus. And then we have Ms. Matvichuk, who generally, as with Ms. Katie Fox, did not want to judge as the head of a NGO in Ukraine about social reform. I think we understand the consideration to abstain from judging the country. However, she also pointed out that it depends on how you judge. Are you looking at this year? Because in general, Ukraine has improved, but are you looking year to year and in what aspects? And Father Porosenko, which I believe got some of the most comments on Ukraine on our chat, given his spirited explanation of the faith in Ukraine, I would say his grade is somewhere around a B because he did touch on various different factions about what's happening in Ukraine. Now, the one thing I haven't included, Walter, is the very important aspect of the audience. The audience, correct. So I'm going to bring up the audience right now. Let's see. We have today's grades. There we are. Okay, so today, if I go back to in reverse order, talking about the viable social cohesion. In that respect, we had the majority, 44% of respondents, again agreeing with the experts of an A minus B plus. So that's more than anything in line, the outliers being 1 vote higher and 1 vote quite lower, but most people voted in terms of with the experts, as well as the plenary session number 3. That was first thing this morning about even greater general security. The greatest amount of replies was in the B area, but B minus is almost up there. So B minus, and I would say that that is also close to where we were overall. Remember, the expert Alexander Gray was a B minus. Volker was closer to a B, B plus from James Scher. So maybe a half step below where the experts are. Maybe the audience is looking for something slightly more. I have another grade to give. That being the sorry, I have the grades from yesterday. Here we go. Sorry about this. I have too many social media things on. Hey, here we go. Day 1 grades. Day 1 grades are in front of me. We go back to, in reverse order again, developed market economics and energy security. So most of the same people who are on today voting, they gave an overall grade of a C. Now, this is around where we were with the experts. Mr. Cohen gave a C+, Ms. Jurkiw gave a C+. So either slightly below or right on where the experts were. So that's the audience for developed market economics. And last in reverse order, robust democratic politics, assessing Ukraine's progress, regress. I know in the chat, there was a lot of discussion about what is the state of Ukraine's parties. That was something that was asked of Mr. Nix and Ms. Fox, as well as all the other speakers. And in that respect, we got overall some grades of B, B- from the experts, and from the public, B- C+ was the top vote getter. So in terms of the panels yesterday, we are just half a grade below where the experts are in terms of those panels. So I think that goes along with last year's results, the first time we did a public poll, where we also saw that the audience sometimes judges Ukraine more harshly than our experts. That's all I got for you.
Okay.
Thank you, Andriy, for that hard task of tallying up those grades and presenting our 2020-2021 report card for Ukraine. In closing, please allow me on behalf of the sponsoring organizations to thank all of our distinguished speakers who shared their expertise and knowledge with us, and all of you who took time out of your busy schedules to join us on screen yesterday and today for this very timely forum. I know that everyone who spoke is a true friend of Ukraine, and I hope that we can work together to encourage and assist Ukraine in implementing the necessary reforms, but also to make sure that the West remains committed to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic future. Finally, on behalf of the sponsoring organizations, I would like to send our sincerest gratitude to our patrons that made the 9th Report Card Conference possible. Please join me in thanking the Heritage Foundation of First Security Federal Savings Bank, Self-Reliance New York Federal Credit Union, and the Jurkiw Family Fund for their continued financial and moral support of our work. Thank you for attending, and we do hope to see you at our next conference. I suspect our next conference will be in the next few months. So look forward to seeing you. Slava Ukraini.
Heroям слава.
Great.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much.